Hi all, hope your summer's going well. We're currently in the middle of renovations over here at TYTD Towers. Things are going well and we hope to be back with you soon. But in the meantime, those wonderful folks over at Mount Molehill gave me permission to share this little gem from the vaults. Back in 2020, when they were known as Channel 83, they very kindly had me on their show to talk about the 1986 movie Star Crystal. This episode's been unavailable for a little while, so they've allowed me to share it with you here. So, enjoy. And long live the new flesh.
Hello Videodrones, and thanks for tuning in to Channel 83. We are the TV guide for weirdos, the video word made flesh, evangelists of the obscure, and this week, we've gone radioactive. Purely by coincidence, we have our second guest tonight, and we're again talking about a sci-fi horror film, 1986's Star Crystal. I didn't plan it out that way, but this film has been burning a hole in my review pocket ever since I first saw it a few months ago. This is a movie that I didn't feel I could do justice by myself, so I've called in an expert on all things obscure. Our guest tonight is Dan of TYTD Reviews. Dan, how are you doing this evening?
Hello, nice to see you. I'm not too bad today. How are you about yourself? You doing good?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. So I first discovered Dan's work by randomly stumbling upon a video he did called That Warm Fuzzy Glow, wherein Dan extols the virtues of VHS. I was very impressed with the production values of the video and began to dive into Dan's channel, and pretty soon I was looking forward to the weekly video upload.
Oh, it's very kind of you to say. Thank you very much.
You are very welcome. So for the people that are unfamiliar with your work, Dan, tell us a little bit about your channel, what you do, why you do it, and the genesis of TYTD.
Yeah, sure, okay. So, basically, my channel started in 2017. Mainly started because I got incredibly fed up of trying to find information about obscure, sort of low to no budget films that, just weren't really prevalent on the internet. The amount of times I'd find a film for sale and I'd go, well, right, I'll just check out a bit of information on that. And apart from maybe a couple of sentences on IMDb and a review uploaded 12 years ago in 120p with somebody recording on the side of a toaster, basically saying, yeah, the film's all right. There wasn't really any detail there. There wasn't really any information about direction, about cinematography, about the look and the feel. So I set the channel up to sort of tackle those kinds of films in a lot more detail than was available at the time. From there, two other shows spun off from the channel. One was called The Red Triangle, which is more sort of adult features, art house films, things like that, stuff that's a little bit harder than your bog standard, B-movie or forgotten film. And then there's also one called The Comedy Dining Experience, which I do with my friend and co-host Ben, and we basically do feature commentaries for a mixture of sort of cult mainstream films and also these forgotten films as a way of giving them some kind of extra features, because 9 times out of 10 when you buy these films there's just a scene selection and a trailer and that's it. So we thought it'd be quite nice to give a bit more flesh to them, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean the special features thing is certainly true of the film we're going to talk about tonight.
Absolutely.
I think, Dan and I first connected because he listened to one of my episodes that was kind of a similar ilk to his video that I was talking about earlier. And, when you're into this sort of weirdo stuff, you're kind of just like, I've found a man after my own heart. How awesome.
A kindred spirit.
Yeah. So one question I want to know is, what does TYTD stand for?
Oh, right. Okay. So it's a bit of a long story. So originally I was a filmmaker, and I still sort of am a filmmaker. I do dabble in and out of making things even now. But I worked in a post-production house for like 5 years as an editor, doing sort of projects for companies like Lego and theme parks, and we did one for Buckingham Palace at one point, which was just crazy. Yeah. But basically, after about 4 or 5 years of working there, the company that I was working with were relocating to literally like the opposite side of the country. And they said to me, well, you can keep your job, but you'll have to sort of move. And obviously, I've got a lot of family in the area where I worked. So I made the decision to stay where I was. And not go with them, because it would mean effectively leaving my partner and my family behind, because they've all got sort of connections there. So I sort of left that job, but didn't want to stop making films and didn't stop wanting to keep my skills fresh in terms of editing and sort of talking about films and being knowledgeable in that area. So I started the YouTube channel as part of like several big projects. I had started doing like music video production. I started doing film production. These reviews were one of the things that I did. I worked in advertising for a bit, and I set up all of these little companies doing little bits and pieces under a banner of TYTD, which was sort of shorthand for a sort of caption, Too Young to Die, but then I abbreviated it down to TYTD, and now it doesn't really mean anything. And then slowly over about 12 to 18 months, each one of the projects that I put out slowly closed down. But the film one, I really got into. I really liked the idea of talking about movies, especially the obscure ones. And when it was coupled with the fact that I couldn't find information on these films, it kind of just became a thing that I channeled a lot of my energy into. And since then, for the last 2 years, it's been my main focus, really.
Yeah, I mean, watching your videos and just hearing the way you talk about films, it was no surprise to learn when you told me that you have a background, like, as you said, post-production, and you went to film school as well. So one of the things I was kind of interested to know is, have you always been interested in the obscure and cult side of things before you had any formal experience? And if so, did you ever feel like your quote unquote lowbrow interest clashed with the highbrow institutions?
It's funny you should say that, really, because funny enough, I was listening today to your podcast that you did with George from the Littlest Horror House in Philly.
Oh, yeah.
And he was talking about a very similar thing, and it got my sort of brain thinking, well, where did I begin with it? Because as a kid, I had absolutely no interest in films whatsoever. Between sort of the ages of 0 and 13, like, I was doing anything but film. It was literally the furthest thing from my mind. And after thinking about it really long and hard, I sort of came to the conclusion that there were two significant moments that sort of moved me into that direction. One of them was my dad. When I was a very young kid, I was away from school quite a bit in places. And as a way to kind of sort of semi-babysit me, my dad would put films on that he had in his film collection, which largely consists of, now I realise, some of the just silliest films ever made. Things like Rocky IV. And he used to play First Blood as well. And I'd just sit there and just take these films and just think, how goofy are these films? And it was only when I thought about it recently that I was like, oh, crap, that probably really did impact how I sort of went on. And then as I sort of grew up and went to high school, I met some kids who were big on horror. They had tapes, and I'd recorded some stuff off TV, so we'd sort of swap tapes. So I'd be like, oh, I've got, Friday the 13th part 5, 6, and 7. I'll trade you for Nightmare on Elm Street 1, 2, and 3, which was a much worse trade for the other person, in my opinion. But, so that sort of grew my sort of base in terms of that. And then one of the biggest influences that I had in sort of really getting into the nitty-gritty of it was James Rolfe, the YouTube Angry Video Game Nerd guy.
Yeah.
He did Monster Madness every October throughout the 2000s, and that was basically sort of where I got my linchpins into B-movie cinema, because quite often he would cover obscure Bela Lugosi movies and things like Clark Palo and all of these other quite obscure, kooky 50s directors, just as sort of throwaway titles in his month of monster movies. So using that as a kind of grounding point, I was then able to sort of expand out. So I'd say that those two and watching the tapes were probably my biggest influence to getting me into that sort of field. I mean, obviously, one of my favourite lifesavers in all of this was Mystery Science Theatre, because those guys really blew the lid off the whole thing. We didn't have that over here in the UK. They never screened it. They did the last season of MST, and they played it at 2:00 in the morning on a satellite-only channel, and satellite TV wasn't really very common in the UK in the 90s. So literally, I didn't discover Mystery Science Theatre until I was like well into my teens, just purely because I found it on YouTube. But that opened the doors. I have seen some schlock in my time now, thanks to those guys.
Yeah, fellow Minnesota boys, I want to point out.
Ah, very nice, very nice. But yeah, they were definitely big influences in my film taste, and from there, obviously, I learned about films like Rocket Attack USA and Star Crash and The Ring of Terror. Ring of Terror is a terrible movie. But they're the kind of things that really attract me in, because one of the things when I was in film school, one of the things that really, really bothered me about film school was there was a general atmosphere of these are the good films, these are the bad films, and we need to analyse the good films to figure out why they were good. And my argument was always, well, you're doing that and that's fine, but why aren't you analysing the bad films to see what made them bad?
Yeah.
And I sort of sat there and thought, well, if everybody's only watching good stuff, they're only going to make stuff that they know is, quote, good in that sense. But if they don't see what makes a film bad, they're not going to know how that works. So that was an avenue that I always ended up going down and exploring, much to the annoyance of my fellow classmates, because one of the things that our university promoted was the idea that you would show your work in semi-regularly, which would mean for most students, they'd come out with things like The Big Lebowski or an analysis of Tarantino's filmography, and I'd turn up with Bela Lugosi meets a Brooklyn gorilla and just start and just completely destroy the room in about an hour and a half, which was always good fun.
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful thing. Like, I mean, we can all appreciate the best of the best, but I don't know. I feel like you might have a similar feeling about this. It's like with stuff like that, you know, what is you or I really going to add to the conversation about that? Whereas with your channel and my podcast as well, I think it's much more interesting to talk about maybe not even things that are necessarily bad, but just things that no one else is talking about.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree. I mean, like I say, everybody has dissected, you know, the first Halloween film, the first Nightmare on Elm Street film. Everybody knows the meanings of the secrets of Reservoir Dogs or things like that. But to sort of sit down and see somebody, you know, break down Robot Monster for an hour and a half and just really properly drive home exactly what works and what doesn't work with it. That, I think, is quite impressive a feat to do, mainly because it largely involves hours and hours of research into the backgrounds of not only the directors, but, you know, the actors and things like that. It's real dedication if you're going to sit through a schlock movie to give it the proper full-blown analysis. So I really do appreciate it whenever I find anything that's high quality in that level in terms of going into those films and breaking them down properly.
Yeah, it's one of those things, you know, The Shining has a whole documentary about The Shining. And then some of the stuff you and I touch, it's sometimes impossible to nail down the actual names of the actors and directors.
Yes, we actually, funnily enough, you were involved in really helping me with one of them in an episode that's coming up. Funnily enough, there was a film that I am reviewing in September called The True Game of Death. And when I got the film and I put it in, all of the titles and credits were in Cantonese. And I literally could not tell you who any of the people were. So I went onto IMDb and went onto Wikipedia looking for who the director was, who the writers were. And in the place of where they should be was just a blank box. So even like the Internet Movie Database doesn't know, you're in trouble. So I chucked a call out on Twitter just saying, does anybody know anything about this? And you went onto the Hong Kong IMDb and managed to find a name, which then led down a rabbit hole of a completely different nature. It took about 2 hours of figuring out who this new writer potentially was. But yeah, no, I mean, like I say, just help like that has really helped sort of flesh out these films that otherwise nobody's really cared about looking into over the years. So it's always nice when we meet people of a similar mindset who can, you know, sort of help keep these films in the consciousness, you know. I
mean, this stuff, like, nobody has written the book on any of this stuff. And some of it's, you know, not even really documented. For instance, you know, the Shaw Brothers, famous production company out of Hong Kong, they have a really nice book about it, but they completely skip over all of the horror movies that the Shaw Brothers did, which was, you know, obviously my main interest in looking into that book. So it's definitely a struggle for people of us that don't have connections and are of limited means. And sometimes the primary sources have either passed away or don't speak the same language. It's just a constant going down a rabbit hole, it seems like.
Absolutely. And if it's not that, then it's finding books that were published 20 or 30 years ago where new light has come in and no revisions have been made. So you get books that are packed with things like misinformation. One of the things that I've been working on recently that's been a big project for me is I've been looking into the works of William Castle. And his films, things like The Tingler, 13 Ghosts, Homicidal. And one of the things that you always find when you look into William Castle as a filmmaker is 90% of the people who review his films or review his sort of career say, oh, he was the king of gimmicks, and he'd have a Percepto, a buzzer in The Tingler that would, wake people up, or Illusiono, a special mask you'd put over your eyes so you could see ghosts in the film. But the reality of it was that he'd probably do that for maybe a week in a very select number of theatres, and then he would stop doing that. And he'd reprocess the films to chop out any mention of the gimmicks that were included. But the way that all the books are written make it sound like, you could walk into your local chain cinema any day of the week that a film of his was playing and just, get the full experience, where the reality was it had like a week playing in 3 cinemas like that, and then after that it was recut, so it was never that way again. So the way that most people would have actually experienced the film was vastly different from how books and people talking about it generally present it. And it's just been fascinating sort of digging through the inaccuracies that come with the sort of pitfalls of these early compilations of bad movie history. I mean, one of the ones I would love to see, and it's never been put together, is a history of Poverty Row, which was it was like a couple of blocks worth of buildings and studios in Hollywood in the 1950s where all of the really, really bad filmmakers ended up. Mm-hmm. So you'd have the places like where The Mad Monster or The Robot versus the Aztec Mummy or Ed Wood did a lot of filming in there as well. And it ran for about 30 or 40 years, just turning out utter crap, and it was beautiful, but they've never really properly documented it. There's like 3 or 4 paragraphs on Wikipedia and I think a couple of YouTube videos on the subject, and that's it. And it'd be so interesting just to see how these studios functioned, what their sort of idea was with sort of making movies that was so radical or different or cheaper than what the main studios were doing in Hollywood at the time.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy how some of these things that loom so large in the zeitgeist, like Poverty Row you were just talking about. And one thing I've had trouble finding information on is the Guinea Pig series out of Japan, which is very notorious, but somehow there's not good information on it. So it's pretty crazy how these things that, culturally are so large, you really can't dig into them past a surface level because the sources just don't exist.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking of the Guinea Pig films, especially in UK journalism, whenever those films get brought up, and they do get brought up on occasion, it's very much done with a sort of tugging of the collar and sort of, well, we don't talk about those kinds of films, and that's arguably quite tragic, because without those films existing, a lot of more modern horror films and a lot of more modern experimental films certainly just wouldn't have anywhere near the same amount of punch. I mean, there's a lot of Asian cinema in particular that is just completely undocumented or in absolutely awful archival quality. The amount of martial arts movies I've covered now where the print has turned up with about 10 minutes missing, cropped in by about 20% more than it needs to be, with the sides of it cut off, so about a third of the picture quality is missing, and it's blown out to the point where any shot outside is you're just staring at a white screen. I mean, it's just insane. The state of presentation for Asian cinema outside of the quote classics is just awful. And it's a real shame, because I'd love to see some of these films. One of my all-time favourite martial arts movies that is also a bad movie, but is also a good movie, is The Dragon Lives Again, which is a Bruceploitation film that was made, I believe, a year after he died. And the whole plot of it, first of all, is a copyright nightmare. The idea is Bruce Lee gets sent to hell, and he teams up with Popeye and Kwai Chang Caine to fight Dracula, the priest from The Exorcist, Clint Eastwood, James Bond, and Emmanuel, and The Godfather. And it's one of my all-time favourite films. It was one of the first bad movies that I actually managed to get my hands on, and it's the DVD presentation of it should be presented in 4:3, but because of an authoring error, it's stretched to 16:9, and you can't turn that off. It's just stuck like that. The beginning and the end of the film are cut off, so you basically start halfway through the titles and finish halfway through the credits. and it's just in a terrible state. It just looks really, really awful. And I've desperately tried to get a VHS copy because I've been told that the VHS version of the transfer is a little bit cleaner, and it's also in 4:3, which is closer to what its original presentation should be. But I've never seen one for sale, and I've been told that when they do pop up, they go for just ridiculous money because apparently it's quite rare.
Yeah.
But that's one of my grail films. If I could get any film, remastered in 4K and released on Blu-ray, it would be the film where Bruce Lee and Popeye fight Dracula.
Yeah, I mean, that's a similar thing is kind of what prompted me to go on that little rant about media preservation. If you dig into Japanese cult cinema at all, it's not going to be too far before you run into the name Shozen Fukui, who's the director of Rubber's Lover and 964 Pinocchio, which are pretty well-known Japanese cult films. But he has a lot of films before that were only released 100 copies each in one specific video store in Japan. God. So that's just another one of those things. Like, I don't really have any particular attachment to him as a director, but just the fact that these things exist have such an allure for me. And now, like, it's like a personal mission for me to find them.
I totally can relate to that. I mean, over here we have the Video Nasties, and I recently did a watch party during this current world event that's going on, showing two documentaries called Video Nasties: The Definitive Guide, Volume 1 and 2. And for those who don't know, the original idea of the Video Nasties was in 1984. The British government became absolutely terrified that if an adult or a child watched films like Tenebrae or Zombie Flesh Eaters or The Evil Dead, that they would suddenly turn into axe-wielding maniacs who wanted to take out half of the population. So they passed a law that legally banned these films and put out like a literal legal requirement for video shops to hand these tapes into the police to be destroyed. So there's like 33 films that are on relatively limited supply, but they're all extremely expensive to get your hands on. I mean, I'm quite lucky that I own 3 of them. I'd quite like to own the full set, but I own The Evil Dead, I own Tenebrae, and I own a film called The Bogeyman, or The Boogeyman it is over in the States.
Yeah.
And those films, I stumbled on them by chance, and I'm incredibly grateful I did, because they're just ludicrously expensive, and I would never have been able to afford them in real life. But to hold in my hands, an original release copy of The Evil Dead that realistically should be in a fire somewhere it's just such a satisfying feeling. So, I can definitely relate to your quest.
Yeah, it's crazy. I guess being an American, I don't really think about it, but we really are spoiled for genre films. I mean, how do you feel like that sort of Video Nasties thing affects like the cult and genre film, I guess, community in the UK?
Before the internet, it was a completely different field. Basically, unless you went to America physically and smuggled films into the UK, most horror films and sci-fi films that came out over here were very heavily cut in one way or another. One that surprised a group of people I was talking to recently was Reanimator. I only watched Reanimator for the first time about 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
I was way behind on the times. It came out uncut for the first time in the UK about 3 years ago. And before that, the only way you could watch it was in a partially cut, and before that, a heavily cut VHS version, which made it almost not worth bothering watching, because the way that the BBFC works over here is they'll watch a film, and as soon as the horror bit starts, they'll just cut, and then they won't cut back until the horror bit has stopped. So you ended up with a load of horror films widely available that had no horror in it. Which was just an absolute nightmare. So with the majority of what people consider the sort of staple classics, things like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 and, Hellraiser and things like that, because they didn't come out uncut until, the late 90s, early 2000s over here, it meant that the horror community was very much sort of coveting the nasties and those kind of films that were available uncut before everything got banned, but also sort of very almost black market-esque in terms of trying to sneak these uncut versions back into the country. Nowadays, it's not as big of a problem. A lot of UK fans are very much on the same page as the US counterparts. I wouldn't say it's as tight a knit a community, but we do have some old guards that we still kind of huddle around. Like In the US, you guys have Fangoria. Over here, we have a magazine called The Dark Side that's very, very similar.
Much cooler name, in my opinion.
It revels in the sort of gothic horror, sort of pulpy era of horror films. So whilst it does cover modern flicks, like the front covers are always sort of draped in these really nice sort of 50s, 60s style movie poster art styles for various horror films that have either come out recently or are soon to be available. Which was really nice. They did one a while ago where they did a feature on Christopher Lee, and it was a really nice sort of hand-drawn movie poster style of him in all of his sort of iconic horror roles over the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s. It looks gorgeous. But yeah, so they kind of attract fans, and obviously we have horror conventions over here, but nowhere near to the scale of some of the US ones I've seen. I've seen some absolutely massive US ones that would blow my mind if they came over here, but UK ones tend to be they rent out like a school. And they sort of open a couple of classrooms and sort of dump in, the guy who played the third bodyguard in the film Contamination, and that's your top lot. But yeah, it's a lot quieter over here, I would say. But the people who are in it are no less enthusiastic.
Yeah, I mean, just to make you feel a little bit better, the one horror convention I've ever been to was a Texas Frightmare Weekend, which is actually one of the bigger ones in the U.S. because Texas is a large state. And that was just at like an airport Hilton. So from your side, it might seem like it's glamorous, but the reality is, it's not that special.
Funnily enough, there is one horror convention coming up on this side that I'm quite interested in. I'm really umming and ahhing because it's a little bit out of the way from where I live. I'd be looking to travel about 3 hours, but they've got Felissa Rose and Tom Atkins attending, and I really want to get my copy of Halloween 3 signed.
Absolutely.
I really want to. That and Drive Angry. I want to get Drive Angry signed at some point because that film is just insane.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of cross-pollination that goes on between the various obscure film fandoms. I'm primarily a horror fan, but once you get so deep into something, you have to kind of start looking elsewhere to get your fix. So I'm curious, would you consider yourself an exploitation fan that's tangentially interested in horror as a result, or how do you see it?
I mean, I generally consider myself fairly eclectic. I wouldn't say that I was a solid out-and-out horror fan because a lot of horror that I've watched, I'm not massively into, but when I do land on horror that I like, I'm totally smitten with it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'll watch anything. I mean, at the minute, right. I've literally just behind me, I've got like 3 or 4 massive shopping bags that are just full of DVDs, and it ranges from kids' films to action films to animations, Christmas films, horror, you name it, it's all in there.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that sort of unites them all is more of the badness of it. It's the finding that unique spark. There's usually a moment in a film where I'll sit there and something will happen, whether it's a character saying a line or the way an actor looks down the barrel of the camera or the way a set is just arranged in a particular way, and it will just click in my brain and I'll go, yeah, I've got a good one here. And that'll be it then. That'll be the next hour and a half. I'm on the roller coaster. I'm loving life. I'm just taking in the moment and just loving it to pieces. There's no sort of, I mean, in terms of limits, I'm very, very liberal when it comes to things like horror and sci-fi. So exploitation is something I'm massively into. I like blaxploitation, Nazi-sploitation, unsploitation, anything with exploitation at the end of it. I'm usually probably going to be into it. I mean, there are some extreme ends of the fringe where I'm not as interested, but that's more down to the tone of the films that are set. So, for example, I know that there are some Mondo films that are fairly near the knuckle that even I kind of sit there and go, I might not review this one today. Of all the video nasties, there's only one that I can't watch regularly, and that's Cannibal Holocaust. I've watched it twice, and both times when the credits rolled, I've just had to sort of stand up and slowly float to the window to wonder what I'm doing with my life.
Yeah, I know. That's one of those ones I've seen probably 3 or 4 times. It's one of those ones that, I discovered in my younger edgelord days. And at the age of 31, I kind of think I'm good on ever seeing it again.
Yeah. Well, I made a deal with Ben, my co-host. He's never seen it before. That when my channel eventually sort of rolls over to 1,000 subscribers, I'm going to take him and my partner, who's also a massive animal lover, and make them sit down and watch it with me as a commentary.
Mm-hmm.
Just mainly because I'm a massive sadist, and I love the idea of just sort of getting to the turtle scene and knowing that the turtle scene's coming up, but knowing that they don't know that is just going to be quite a satisfying moment for me. It's the only joy I'll probably get out of that film. But the plan is to do a commentary to it, to do a review for it, and then never watch it again. That being said, it's pretty much a more fool me situation, because I actually went and bought Cannibal Holocaust 2 quite recently. It's known as Green Inferno, and that is a colossal waste of time. That was literally an hour and a half film where some guys get into a plane, fly to an island, meet some cannibals, sort of wave at them a bit, then get back on the plane and leave, and that's it. There's just nothing in there at all. The soundtrack's all right, but the rest of it, ugh.
Yeah, I mean, that should be, if you ever write a book on Italian cinema, that could be the title right there. The soundtrack's all right, but the rest.
Yeah, oh, totally.
I guess just to change gears here a little bit, jumping back to, you were and are a filmmaker. So I guess one question I have is, anyone that listens to this show, one of the 6 or so movies that are not horror that I've gone out of my way to review was a film called The Quest for Fire. Have you ever seen that movie?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so it was directed by Jean-Jacques Annaud, and it has Everett McGill and Ron Perlman in it. Basically, the premise of it is that it depicts cavemen. There's no human language in it. And it's a very interesting film. But so the whole story behind it is Jean-Jacques Annaud is a French filmmaker. He won an Academy Award for his film. I want to say it was called Color in Black and White. It was a sort of like documentary black comedy thing. And so after he won the Academy Award for that, suddenly Hollywood has an interest in him, and he gets a blank check to write this absolutely non-mainstream crazy film about cavemen with elephants dressed up as woolly mammoths. So my question to you is, imagine a similar scenario for Dan. You make a very small art house film, and suddenly everyone in Hollywood wants a piece of you, and you get a blank check to do a crazy passion project. What would it be?
Oh, now that's a question. I mean, one of the... You see, what probably won't help my case here at all is, whilst I did a major in film, I had the choice to do a minor, so I chose to... basically, they gave me 2 choices. They said you can either do a minor in advertising, and you can do a minor in experimental or art house film. And I said, well, which one will make me money? And they said advertising. And they said, well, which one's going to be more fun? And they went art house. So I went art house, which was great because it basically meant that I got to spend 2 years watching David Lynch and Bergman films, which was really good fun. If I had the blank check, a lot of the films that I've made have been experimental and sort of arty. I mean, what is his name now? There's a director called Tom Rubnitz. He was an underground filmmaker who did a lot of work with the B-52s. He predominantly helped them direct a couple of their music videos, but he also did a documentary of their first US tour. And his style is very colourful, very creative, very... I'm struggling to find the word, to be honest. It's very kitsch, very sort of lively, 50s and 60s-esque inspired, over-the-top glam cinema, very boisterous. And that's an element of... he was one of the first directors that really caught my eye, and he's a great inspiration to some of the work that I've done. So I tend to deal in the 2 extremes. If I had a blank check, I would probably either go incredibly grand and bombastic and colourful and surreal and just out there in that direction, and the other side is incredibly isolated and dark and shut down. One of the ideas for a film that I had for years, and I was never able to get it together, and it's only really a fairly small budget idea, and now it's more relevant than ever, really, thinking about it, is I had an idea of a person who lives in a family house wakes up one morning to find that their doors have been bricked up and they can't leave. And the phone lines have been cut and the internet's turned off, but they've got enough food and supplies to last them for like at least a few months. And
Sounds
the film
very
would just
similar to Star Crystal in a weird way.
well, yeah, basically. But the film would just sort of then follow their sort of slow degeneration into their own sort of mind. And again, that would become kind of colourful, but a little bit unnerving and unsettling in places. So yeah, I'd probably have my person slowly loses their mind film if I was going to do anything like that. I quite like the idea of exploring people's thoughts and seeing how, you know, the mind can degenerate over time if there's not contact or no way to sort of communicate your feelings to people. If you're sort of left alone long enough, what would happen is something that's always kind of fascinated me as an idea. So that would probably be the way that I'd go. Either that or a sort of almost Pee Wee Herman-esque sort of crazy adventure movie. One of the two.
Yeah, that's quite a spread there.
I don't do things by halves.
I guess to kind of build on that conversation, one of the things anyone that follows me on Twitter or listens to this podcast knows that I'm just absolutely crazy for Larry Cohen.
Oh, I love Larry Cohen.
Watching his films, it's something I got in like very late in my life comparatively. But once I saw It's Alive, I was just like, this guy, he gets it. If I ever wanted to be a filmmaker, he's what I would aspire to. So do you have a similar film icon that you sort of have those feelings about?
Like I say, so in terms of sort of small-time directors, Tom Rubnitz, again, was a really big influence. He did a couple of his short films on YouTube. One's called Strawberry Shortcut, and the other is called Pickle Surprise. If you ever get a chance to watch them, they're only a couple of minutes long each, but they pretty much sum up his shtick pretty succinctly.
Okay.
I like very sort of colourful and diverse directors, people who are a bit sort of out there. I always have trouble pronouncing his name, but it's the guy who directed House, 1977, the Japanese horror film.
Right.
I can't remember it. I can't pronounce his name properly. I always get it horribly wrong. But he's an influence in terms of style and sort of colour and that sort of dreamlike woozy vibe. But then there's also sort of slightly more straight-cut directors, people like Tinto Brass. I mean, I love the works of Tinto Brass. I know that a lot of people see him as quite a controversial director, but mainly people sort of think of Caligula. But from about 1989 to 1999, that 10-year window, he went absolutely insane. Like, all of his films are just really hyper-colourful, man-hating, like, just binge fests of colours and sights and sounds. It's just, he went from one of the most muted sort of directing styles and colour palettes to one of the most bombastic in the space of about 3 years, which I don't know what happened to him. After 99, he started doing really sort of slightly more sleazier films that I'm not as big on, but that 10-year gap of 89 to 99 is just crazy in terms of sort of style and narrative threads. I've never really encountered anything like it. Every single film he made in that 10-year window is completely challenging for completely different reasons.
Wow. Yeah, I gotta say I'd never heard the name until I heard you mention it in some other conversation.
Absolutely. He's a very strange director. A lot of people look at his 70s work as being his sort of best stuff because obviously he did Caligula and Salon Kitty and The Key is another one that's held in very high critical regard. But in the 90s, he basically went sort of full sort of trash in a way, but in a really good way.
Okay.
And it's that 10-year window, like I say, it's just basically every film is almost completely different, but is all sort of super colourful and super expressive. And you really get the feeling that by the end of the films, you know the guy, like personally, because he's so heavy-handed with the messages he's trying to put out that you can't not finish one of his films and go, oh, so he thinks that. Okay, fair enough.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess to get back on the subject of your channel, this is something I love about discovering new YouTube channels or podcasts or blogs or whatever that trades in movie reviews is how each one of us has sort of their own touchstones for what is the worst thing they've subjected themselves to. One of the things you bring up quite a bit is Let's Ruin Dad's Day.
Oh, God.
But I'm curious to know, what is the worst horror film you've seen and why is that?
Oh, I think the worst horror film I've ever seen is probably, I'm going to say it's Clark Palo's Ring of Terror. The only horror film that's billed as a horror film, but is actually a teen comedy. I'm not even joking. The basic plot of the film is it opens with like a an Ed Wood Cosmos style piece where somebody's sort of staring down the barrel of the camera telling us that, the future is uncertain and it's scary times. And he sort of gets up and just wanders out of his office straight into a graveyard. Almost like the partitioning door just takes you straight into a graveyard, where he spends about 5 minutes looking for a cat. And he just shouts this cat's name over and over again for about 3 or 4 minutes.
The one with the cat named Puma?
Yeah, he just keeps shouting Puma.
In the 3K episode.
Yeah. And then the rest of the film is just like a screwball high school comedy that's really, really, really unfunny. Like, the best joke in the whole thing is he picks on 2 fat people for like a minute. And even then, that's not funny. It's just sort of, oh, okay, well, fair enough. And then the film ends with a guy seeing a hand fall out of bearing in mind the guy's a mortician, seeing a hand fall out of a slab, like this body on a slab, and a hand drops down, and he freaks out, and then it cuts to the narrator saying, yeah, he died, the end. And I've never seen a film that was just so glibly in your face about how little it cared about the viewer. It literally, I mean, I don't know what Clark Palow's mindset was on it. Because, I mean, generally, I consider people like Coleman Francis to be some of the worst long-term filmmakers, but Palow really only had that one dabble into horror, and by far it's the worst horror film I've ever seen. When I finished the review for it, I vowed I would probably never, ever watch it again, unless it was Rift. That's the only good thing to come out of the whole thing, was like 20 years later, MST3K got to riff it. And they arguably had some of the best jokes in it. So
yeah, I mean, I remembered it just by you mentioning that there was a cat. So
no, it's a terrible, terrible film. But that's part of the sort of damage when you review films like this, is sometimes you do just get absolute stinkers, but it's worth it for the gems. It's worth it when you find those so bad it's good films that just sort of sit right with you, and you can kind of, break it down and say, well, this is why it's funny and this is why it works. But occasionally you do get the odd sort of basically stone film that's just you can't, impenetrable. You can't really work it out, and it just sort of exists, and you're
I mean, I guess that's kind of something I can relate to. When I first started the show, every single movie I watched was randomly chosen to fit into some arbitrary theme that I had come up with for an episode. So, for instance, one of them that I never actually ended up doing was just called The Uninvited theme, wherein all 3 movies in that episode were called The Uninvited, because horror films are terribly unoriginal with their naming. So the downside of that, I found, is that when you just randomly watch any sort of schlock, there's maybe 15% of it is really good, 15% of it is really terrible, but the other 70% of it is just okay. So I found myself saying, reviewing a movie and just saying, the acting was okay, the effects were okay, the cinematography was okay.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you kind of have noticed that same thing, and how has that affected your selection of what movies you review on your channel?
I completely agree with you on that point. I probably find 2, maybe 3 films if I'm lucky a year. Bearing in mind I review probably about between 45 and 50 films a year. I probably find 2 or 3 that I would genuinely be like, that's going on my shelf, I'm going to watch that every year. The rest fall into that sort of grey zone or are genuinely awful. I don't know, I've actually had this debate quite a bit with myself, especially more recently, because I had a few people sort of comment on videos saying things like, why do you review the films that are just okay? And I kind of sit there and I think, well, the main reason why I cover them is because nobody else has, really. Or if they have covered it, they've covered it more sort of in the style of a really quick review where they just sort of go, yeah, it's fine, and they don't elaborate. Or they do sort of like an unboxing type thing where they just sort of read the back of the box of the DVD and then go, yeah, it's all right. So I always debate whether I should cover those grey zone sort of films a bit more, or whether I should just try and pick the best or the worst. But I think that part of, I think the word mission statement isn't right here, but it's the closest I can think. Part of the goal of the channel was to sort of shine a light on the films that had little to no information about them. So I kind of feel like I'm sort of doing what I set out to do if I cover these sort of in the middle movies. I mean, I've had occasions where I've sat there and I've got 20 or 30 films sat in front of me and I only need to pick sort of 18, and I've watched a film that's been so bland, so sort of middle of the road, yep, it's just okay, that I've sat there and gone, I know that there's a film on my shelf that's going to be a little bit worse or a little bit better, because that's the main thing I look for. I look for something that I can just sort of hook into as a driving force. If I have something that just gives me that volition to push a little bit, whether it's, say, one good performance in there or one good use of cinematography or direction, that's enough for me then to sort of get a hook and go, right, okay, I can write this. I've had probably half a dozen films in the entire time that I've watched, where I've been doing this, where I've just sat there and gone, yeah, I can't cover this. There's just nothing. It's giving me absolutely nothing.
Does nothing other than exist in front of you.
Yeah, basically. It's not so bad or boring or irritating that I can rant about it, but it's not so good that I can say it's even all right. It's just there. And I think it's going to find my way into my bin as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you mentioned is that a lot of the reviews that you typically see are very, face value, unboxing type stuff. And on the other side of that, something that you also brought up earlier is that a lot of people getting into YouTube were heavily influenced by James Rolfe and sort of his AVGN persona, which, no shade thrown at him. He was great at what he does. But I think, when you get into this sort of obscure cult territory, there's a lot of people that are just doing sort of that manufactured outrage, like, oh my God, Star Crystal's the worst movie I've ever seen. I wanted to kill myself watching it. Yeah. And so that's really why I latch on to stuff like you and another buddy of mine, Mike at Rotted Reviews, because I do think it's very important, or, not important, not to make YouTube reviews or podcasts sound like more than they are. I'll just say that I really enjoy and respect people that are willing to sit down and sort of take a look at these middling or bad things and not, aren't prone to hyperbole of, this is the worst thing I've ever seen, because you can only see the worst thing you've ever seen so many times before it becomes completely mundane.
Oh, yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you. That's one of the things that I always am very careful, especially when I get to the script editing process, to make sure that I avoid, because the last thing I want to do is manufacture feelings towards a film that just isn't there. I mean, I've had times where I've maybe impressed my own feelings on a film a little too heavily onto it, so maybe I'm seeing things that aren't necessarily there, but that's part of the nature of being a film critic, is the sort of subjective nature of it, the fact that my views on what I see in a film might be completely different from somebody else's. But I think there's only been maybe 4 or 5 times where I've genuinely been upset with a film when I've got to the end of it, and I've felt the need to be really quite angry about it. Because day to day, I'm not really an angry guy. I'm usually pretty mellow at the best of times, so it really takes something to sort of rile me up a bit. The last film I can think of that I watched that really riled me up, there was 2 that I watched in the space of about a couple of months of each other. One was VHS, the 2012 film. That one really annoyed me. It was mainly because of the way that it was presented. I think in one of the reviews, because I did a review for it, I think I called it false advertising in the review, because like 90% of the film isn't actually presented in VHS quality. It's all shot in digital. But the big selling point of it, I mean, one point they have a Skype conversation in that film, and I'm just sat there going, well, you literally cannot get further away from the film's title at this point. What are you doing? So yeah, that one got me pretty riled up. And another one was called Celia, which was a low budget.
I have that in my Tubi queue. It looked interesting, but I've never heard anything about it.
No, don't. I'd give it a swerve. I've got a review for it, funnily enough, coming up, not this week, but the week after. It's one of the few. I've only ever had this reaction with 2 films in the past. This film and Rocket Attack USA, which was a film where I sat there for an hour and 30 minutes and tried my best to like it. I really did, because there's a lot of things in there that had the potential to be good, but it never achieves that level of good. It constantly just sits building up. And then when you get to the payoff, which is nearly an hour and 35 minutes in, the payoff is completely not worth it. And then the film just stops. It doesn't like give you an ending. It doesn't resolve things. It doesn't give you any kind of closure. It literally just stops, and nobody's learnt any lessons, and nobody's developed, and nothing has grown. And I'm not joking. As the credits rolled on Celia, I jumped up from the sofa and just started swearing and pacing back and forth, and just like full blown, like imagine Chevy Chase or Bill Murray having like their biggest sort of explosive rant at somebody, and I was just doing that to the TV screen because I couldn't believe how cheated I felt, having wasted an hour and 40 minutes of my time, because it's billed as a horror film, but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of places advertise Celia as like this almost Omen-esque horror film about childhood imagination gone awry, and it's not. It's a really, really dry documentary style, travel log about a little girl growing up in 1950s Australia. So right out the gate, my expectations were just completely thrown out the window. And then I was just sort of left to sort of stew on this, admittedly relatively well shot, awful movie.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of like you in temperament. It takes a lot for me to get excited or angry about anything. And I think the things that make me angriest are kind of, I don't know, like have to do with my own idiosyncratic personality. I think the movie Gravity, I was angry watching that for the specific reason that most of the dialogue is just Sandra Bullock heavy breathing. So I know that that's not a problem most people had with that movie, but I was yelling at the screen. And then I guess there's like another contingent of movies like Raw or The Babadook that I perceive to be pretentious, and they just set me off in a weird way.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's pretension. I can tolerate pretension just about if the film itself has some eccentric quality to keep me invested. Like, I mean, for example, and I'll just throw in this one, Sarlo is a terrifically pretentious movie. It's basically Pasolini spending nearly an hour and 3/4 saying fascism is bad. Which, yeah, Pasolini, it kind of is, but, I didn't need an hour and 3/4 of you telling me that to drive that point home. But what sells me on it is that every 15 minutes, somebody either gets beaten up, molested horribly, or a prostitute tells a really grotesque story. And just those three elements just sort of keep me sat there going, well, go on, I'll give it another 15 minutes and see what happens. It's just, I don't like in modern cinema at least, I don't like the pretentious level films. The ones like, I couldn't stand Drive. When Drive came out, I really couldn't get into it. The Neon Demon was another one. Just couldn't stand it because it was basically an hour and a half of really, really nice visuals, but absolutely no story. And I have a term on my channel I use whenever I talk about films that are all visuals and no story. It's called a nice video, shame about the song, yes, which is a reference to an old comedy show on the BBC called Not the 9 O'Clock News. I pull up a specific clip from that series whenever I encounter one of these films. And it's just the idea of, because there's a lot, in Hollywood especially today, there is a lot of emphasis on it doesn't matter what the story is as long as it looks good. And I kind of sit there and I think, well, yeah, that is to a point, but I won't be watching it.
Yeah, I gotta say, I totally disagree with you on Drive. I can see what you're getting at with Neon Demon.
Really?
Yeah, it's not my place to sit here and extol the virtue of Nicholas Winding Refn. So I guess on that note, I think now is as good a time as any to dive into our film for this evening, 1986's Star Crystal. So I know you hadn't seen this one prior, but had you ever heard of it?
No, I'd heard absolutely nothing about it until you chucked me the link for the first time. But I did, as soon as you sent me the link, go to check on IMDb whether I'd seen anything related to what the directors or writers had done previously, just so I could sort of get a grasp of what I was getting into. And that was when I found that these directors and writers had done nothing really before or since. And this was just sort of an island to itself, barring one other slightly obscure film.
So it was directed by a guy named Lance Lindsay, who co-wrote the story and screenplay with Eric Waster. It stars C. Justin Campbell, Faye Bolt, John W. Smith, Taylor Kingsley, and Marshall N. So the reason I just listed those out in rapid succession is for the reason that you said, like, none of these people have really done anything other than Star Crystal. Lance Lindsay directed and co-wrote another film that came out 2 years later called Real Bullets, which features a few cast members from Star Crystal in bit parts, and alongside Academy Award winner Martin Landau for some reason. But other than those two films, you won't find any credits to their names, and it's a bit perplexing, really. Very rarely do I find a film that exists in such a vacuum. The only contemporary print reference to this movie that I could find was in a retailer's guide from 1986. The Blu-ray from Kino Lorber doesn't have a director's commentary, and I couldn't find any info about Lance Lindsay other than that he may have also recorded a song in 1973 about the Vietnam War called How Do You Tell a Small Boy? So were you really able to find anything beyond just like the basic IMDb credit stuff?
To be honest, no. I found pretty much as you did. In fact, you found more than me because I didn't know he'd done the 1970s Vietnam song, which...
I have no idea if he did. It's just another guy named Lance Lindsay.
I mean, I'm quite happy to let him have it if you want to. Give him another string to his belt, so to speak. Yeah, no, I found literally pretty much nothing else about this film. The only thing that did shock me a little bit when I was looking through these bits was the IMDb rating for it, which this currently sits at a 3.5 on 860 votes. And I sat there and thought, well, that's a bit low, really, for what this film is. I'll be honest with you, because, I mean, it's not that bad. I mean, then again, I suppose I'm quite I'm kind of used to like truly awful films, so maybe, I'm maybe a little bit finer toned to those kind of movies, but 3.5 seems a little bit low for this, in my opinion, at least. I thought it was quite a bit more enjoyable than that.
Yeah,
but...
I mean, the reason I picked this film to cover with you is partly selfish. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, I just didn't know if I could do it justice by myself, but also because I think a shitty little Alien ripoff is well within your wheelhouse. And I was very interested, as we get into this, to hear your take on this as someone who's worked in the industry and seen it all, because this movie goes in a very bizarre direction. And I want to say for the listeners that we'll be going into full spoiler mode on this one. So if you don't want to have the movie spoiled for you, now is the time to turn this episode off. But I'll also issue a major warning when we get to a very specific point in this movie. And yeah, I mean, there wasn't much to be found on this one. And I have the feeling that likely the only reason that this hasn't been completely forgotten is that it was distributed by New World Pictures, which is Roger Corman's company that's been featured on this show with our reviews of Galaxy of Terror, the other House movie, not the 1977 House, The Brood, and Pin. So it may not have a pedigree, but you can bet that it was stocked on many of video store shelves in the 1980s.
I mean, straight out of the gate, one of the first things I sort of noticed with it tonally was it really rang a bell to a film that I'd covered about a year ago called Alien Species, which was a movie that wasn't shot by Troma but was distributed by it. And the two films are pretty much uncanny in terms of how the sort of plot runs. The only significant difference between the two of them is how the alien exists. But other than that, and a few nudity shots in Alien Species, these two films pretty much run exactly the same plots and have more or less very similar looking sets as well.
Yeah, so I guess it's safe to say this isn't your first rodeo when it comes to alien plagiarism.
No, not at all. Basically, one of the two big games that I played whilst I was watching this film was see how many times I could spot the Millennium Falcon sort of hidden in the background and used as part of sets. And also, how many films does this remind me of based on films that I'd already seen? And I've made quite a comprehensive list of both.
Yeah, we'll get to that as and when those moments pop up. So just chime in and be like, hey, this reminds me of a fucking, I don't even know. But
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, basically, this is just your boilerplate alien ripoff. An uninvited guest stows away on a spaceship and begins killing off the crew members one by one. So the movie begins with some beautiful, twinkly synth music courtesy of Doug Katsaros. The opening scene shows us a routine Mars expedition near the crater Olympus Mons. you can tell it's Mars because of how impossibly red everything on screen is.
Well, this was one of the things, actually, funnily enough, when I watched it the first time, I didn't take a tremendous amount in. I was more for the experience of it, but I rewatched it a second time a couple of days ago as well, just to really try and ingrain it. And those Mars scenes, there was one really glaring thing that I noticed that really bothered me. And it's purely because I'm a little bit of a science nerd in that regard, but there are several shots where there are clouds in the background, and you can clearly, in some shots you can sort of see the blue, but it is very, very red. But those clouds really shouldn't be there on Mars. And I just sat there and was like, oh, well, no.
You say that, but this movie takes place in 2032, although the cover art for the original VHS says 2035, so who knows? But technically, maybe some clouds show up on Mars.
Yeah, okay, I can live with that. I'll take that.
So there's two dudes scanning the Martian landscape with what looks to be a label maker and a megaphone. They pick up on their scanners and begin to dig a hole where they find a nondescript papier-mâché lump coated in metallic paint. So first impressions, Dan, what are you thinking at this point?
The two things that immediately jumped to my mind were, wow, they found the biggest ball of foil in Minnesota. And the second was that whilst it was quite impressive to sort of see them try and replicate Mars in that sense, you really can't get away from the fact that this was clearly shot in a quarry. And they don't even, usually science fiction movies, when they try and show the surface of a planet, they'll sort of slow the footage down, not massively, but just a little bit to kind of make it look a bit weightless. They don't do that here. They just have them sort of trundle along.
I would say that, maybe they terraformed it, if not for the fact that they're wearing some of the shittiest spacesuits I've ever seen. So clearly they can't breathe the atmosphere.
Yeah, I'll take that they've given them gravity and potentially clouds and rain as well. That'll smooth over a lot of the sort of continuity cracks. But at this point, I was kind of still sort of invested. I was sitting there going, okay, well, I wonder which direction this is going to go. And within about 5 minutes of them getting back to the ship, I quickly realized exactly which way it was going to go.
Was it the futuristic Coca-Cola bottles that were the tipping point?
It was the fact that they were very clearly space jocks that got me. I was just constantly on the verge of expecting one of them to say "bro," and it didn't happen. But I was sat there just thinking, well, with films like Alien, and with many even Alien knockoff films, you get these kind of, there's no other word for them, space jocks, where they kind of are there, but they usually have a level of intelligence and competence behind them. They usually have that kind of, even though they play the sort of slab of meat with mittens role, they've got that level of intelligence to prove that they are capable of being in space. These guys have none of that. These guys, one of my favourite bits is as soon as they take the helmet off, they more or less straight away go, yeah, we were the first people to play football in space. And I was just like, yeah, okay, fine. All right. But that Coca-Cola bottle did not go unnoticed, by the way. Can anybody say product placement any louder? And what I particularly love is that the director had clearly told them to always put the bottle down with the Coke label facing the camera, because whenever they pick it up, they always make sure to very carefully put it down in the exact way. And one of the problems that I have with this film starts here, which is that for some reason, the director chooses to linger on sequences that should end a lot quicker for way too long. So there are moments where our cast are just sort of sat around looking at each other, not saying anything, and the plot isn't progressing, but the camera will just keep cutting back and forth to all of their facial expressions, as if to imply, usually doing that for a few seconds kind of gives the audience a better understanding of the situation without you having to say something. So, for example, if somebody is murdered, they'll show close-ups of their facial reactions all looking a bit shocked, and that takes about 2 or 3 seconds to establish, oh no, they're all clearly very upset. Here in this film, he does it about 7 or 8 times. There are just like entire minute-long sections where you're just cutting between people's faces. And nothing is said and nothing is happening. And after about the first pass-through of everybody's face, I sort of go, get on with it. And it just keeps going. And I didn't know. It was ridiculous. I started playing a game of, well, when will it cut? When are they gonna get back to what the film was? Because at the minute, I'm just looking at people's faces,
Yeah, It's a hallmark of low budget films. They got to hit that 90-minute runtime somehow, and that's the way a lot of filmmakers choose to hit that mark. So, like we said, they take this metallic lump back to their ship, sip on some futuristic Coca-Cola, and they explain that the sensors say that this rock is somehow full of electronic circuitry, but none of them really seems to be asked to investigate that any further, so they all just sort of wander off. The metallic lump opens up and begins to emit light, smoke, and some sort of magnetic field. There are some crystals within the lump, star crystals, if you will, and before you know it, the lump has hacked up a loogie, and everyone on board the ship has died of oxygen deprivation. So, they kind of set up, these are going to be the main characters of the movie, but they die probably less than 5 minutes into it.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really sold me on the egg hatching scene, or the lump hatching scene, or whatever that thing is, was the fact that it oozed a mixture of what I assume is curdled green milk, vegetable oil, and what looked like KY jelly. They really go all out in terms of trying to make this thing the slimiest looking egg thing that you've ever seen in your life. I also noticed as well, when the egg was hatching, there's a brief clip of some stuff moving on the table. So you see like scalpels rumbling, but if you look quite closely, you can clearly see all of the wires and all of the lines hooking them up, which was a nice touch. I mean, like I say, I'm a sucker for practical effects like that, and to sort of see such sort of hokey effects being presented in an 80s movie like that was quite charming, I felt. That was one of the few things that I quite like about this film, especially in regards to the models and the model making process, is everything feels incredibly handmade. There's nothing here that really has an aura of this was clearly made by professionals. Everything looks like it was knocked up in somebody's garage in about like an hour and a half.
It all actually has a very Satellite of Love feel to it.
Funnily enough, this was one of the big things that I noticed myself. I sat here, and for the entire first half of the film, all I could think is, this would be a fantastic MST3K episode. This is screaming like Moon 2.0 level of science fiction, because everything is done in such a sort of, again, hokey way. So like all of the performances that you see, even up to this point, are just terrifically, eccentric isn't the right word, but sort of over the top and very kind of not hammy, but sort of in that realm, if you know what I mean. There's a real sort of playing to the camera vibe going on with most of the cast. For the entire first half of the film, and for a couple of scenes in the second half as well, I was just thinking, Joel, Jonah, Mike and the bots would have a real good time tearing this thing a new one, I reckon.
Yeah, definitely. This is definitely a movie. We'll get into this just a little bit later, but you can see how the sausage was made, so to speak, in basically every aspect of this movie.
Absolutely.
So after the crew of that ship dies, it floats through space for 2 months afterwards before arriving at a space station. Now, Dan, set the scene for us. Tell us a little bit about this space station and the marvelous world building within Star Crystal.
So the ship arrives at the star station and a colonel gets out. The colonel talks to a young assistant for a moment while they're in an elevator about, things generally. Not necessarily things relating to the film, but things generally. There is also a board meeting happening with a man in a jacket that says NASA, so you know he's a NASA man. And a general in a general suit, so you know that he's an army man, and a guy wearing braces, a striped shirt, and smoking a cigarette and or cigar, so you know he's a businessman. And the three of them are basically sat sort of semi in silence, but occasionally sniping at each other, trying to figure out which one of them should be held responsible for all of the crew being starved of oxygen.
Yeah.
Then we are introduced to a couple of engineers on board, what's the name of the ship? The SC-37, that's the one. A couple of engineers on board the SC-37 who are there to fix the ship after the the incident on board and restore the sort of oxygen ventilation systems. And then basically the action cuts between the boardroom, where absolutely nothing is being said of any interest to the film, and the ship, where our main characters, Cal and Roger, are just being a couple of guys hanging out and having a bit of a laugh and kind of, doing their own good guy thing.
Yeah.
And
sorry,
go ahead.
Oh, yeah. To back up a little bit, this was kind of the moment where I was like, the first time I was watching it, I was like, I'm going to fucking love this movie, because there's something about the aesthetic of that boardroom scene that I really love, with just sort of like that single light source, chiaroscuro, and there's the synth, the omnipresent synth music playing. For whatever reason, that is completely my shit right there.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. No, that was, funnily enough, it was around about this time as well that I was kind of sitting there going, okay, well, there's definitely something here. And I think for me, what warmed me to it was, again, much like where the original crew of the SC-37, when they do that thing where they cut up on their faces and just keep panning, they do the same in the boardroom again, almost immediately, which... the first time I was kind of like, okay, that was a bit weird. The second time I was like, okay, so this is an actual choice. They're actually choosing to direct the film like this. Okay, fair enough. This could get interesting. And it's just the way that the characters interact with each other. The scripting for this, particularly the boardroom scenes, they're not really written conversationally. They're written more like the actors have been told to just say things to each other. So it's not like you've got actual fluid narrative conversations happening. It's literally just the scientist says something to the general, pause. The general says something to the businessman, pause. The businessman says something generally, pause. And there's no conversational connection. Everything just is kind of being talked at rather than to, which is weird as well, because when you contrast that with Cal and Roger in the spaceship, who are, like I say, very naturalistically, there's still a bit of ham in there, but relatively, relatively naturalistically for this film, just palling around and, having jokes and talking about, what they're going to do when they get back to Earth and all this, that, and the other. It made me sort of think, well, why, if he can write that, why isn't he doing that with the boardroom people? Why is that so static and cold if that's so kind of playful? So, I mean, I don't know whether there was improvisation on set. I tend to find with a lot of low to mid-budget films like this, they do allow actors sort of leeway when it comes to just sort of palling around scenes where they can kind of just chat a bit. But if it was scripted, then it does raise some very serious questions about why some of the parts of this film are so dry in terms of having cast members talk to each other.
So, yeah, I mean, like you said, at this point, we're sort of just like cross-cutting between boardroom and Abbott and Costello through the filter of Roger and Cal. And then suddenly there's a fire in the reactor core of the space station L5. It's so sudden that they don't tell you that happens until 2 or 3 minutes later. Everything just starts rumbling and everyone just starts running around and evacuating. So
has one of my favorite corridor scenes that film has so far. It basically, they took what looks like about 6 foot by 6 foot and put a curved sort of wall up and just told the cast members, run around that curve 3 or 4 times and we'll dump concrete on you. And it's just, I'm a big fan of classic Doctor Who. I love old Doctor Who episodes, and they do a lot of running around corridors. So there's a lot of scope for them to get it wrong. They make it an art form compared to what I've seen in this film. It's literally, I think at one point I even saw one of the walls wobble as they ran round it, because one of the female crew members who gets on board the SC-37 in the sort of panic actually hits one of the walls, and you can clearly see it shake alongside the debris sort of falling down. It's just terrible.
Yeah. And I mean, apart from that, this space station is very clearly an office building. It has escalators in it, which I've never seen in a science fiction movie that's trying to be future-y, but it's very, very obvious that this is just an 80s office complex.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a nice looking office complex, but Yeah, in 2032 or 35, it's maybe a little dated, shall we say.
Yeah, and so this evacuation is what brings us to the actual main characters of the film, because, again, the colonel that was in the boardroom meeting is it seems like he's being set up to be the protagonist of this film. But after the reactor core sets on fire, he is never seen nor mentioned again in this movie. So 5 people evacuate onto the SC-37. Roger Campbell is the repairman that we've seen earlier, and he's now the de facto new captain of the SC-37. We have his partner and resident jokester, Cal, nutritionist, Sherry Stevens, medical officer, Dr. Adrian Kimberly, and the requisite cantankerous engineer in all Alien ripoffs, Lieutenant Billy Lynn. So they narrowly escape on the SC-37 before the space station blows the fuck up and kills, I don't know, hundreds or even thousands of people. And then the crew soon finds out that they're in dire straits. They only have enough food for 3 weeks. Some of it has been contaminated, but it'll take them over a year to get back to Earth. And luckily, there's another space station named Alpha 7, just 120 hours away, where they can stock up on supplies. So far, it doesn't really sound like that bad of a situation, if not for the pulsating goo monster that is hiding out on the ship. And let's talk about this ship, Dan. Run us through the SC-37 real quick.
So even though the SC-37 shows on the map that it's got multiple rooms, there is only about 4 rooms. There's a quarters where, let me get the names. Is it Sherry and Adrian hang out?
Mm-hmm.
There is the engine room where Poundland Sigourney Weaver hangs out. And there's the main engine room where Cal and Roger hang out, the main control room.
Mm-hmm.
And that's about it. But the map shows that, and there's a ventilation shaft, because this is an Alien knockoff movie, which means, of course, there's an Alien ventilation shaft that connects the engine rooms and the main control rooms. They have this really weird situation where they don't have doors on the spaceship. Everything is connected via what looks like ventilation shafts.
Yeah.
Which is quite unusual.
Truly, not ergonomic at all, because they're all about 2.5-3 feet tall.
Yeah, absolutely. Which means that the cast members have to first of all turn a valve, then duck down and sort of huddle through the tunnels before they come out the other side and then can stand up normally. I mean, I know that you've got to save room on a spaceship, but, even Star Trek had nice doors. The least you could do is, not cut costs on that front. Yeah, the spaceship itself, one of the things that I noticed was, if this spaceship was in a 50s B movie or maybe an early 60s B movie, I'd probably be a bit like, okay, well, this, it's of the time. Now it looks positively creaky. It looks really, really dry, in my opinion. The main control room has no windows, for a starters, so they're not really able to see where they're going. But then they do also say that it's computers that run the ship, so why would there be a need for windows? But then the computer's only tied to one person at a time.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's not true either, because later in the film, multiple people can get control of the computer. So the spaceship's a mess. I think that's the nicest way to put it. The spaceship's a really big mess. That's another point as well that I know I picked up on whilst I was watching this. So they tried to go for the steampunk sci-fi aesthetic of having grids instead of floors. So how in sort of sci-fi films in the 80s and the late 70s, they would have it kind of very industrial, and they'd have sort of metal steps and metal grids that people would run across, and it would sort of clink and clank. In this film, they've taken a carpet and spray painted black slats onto it to make it look like a floor. And the best part is that whenever any sort of action happens that involves people being on the floor, you can see the carpet moving. So, which I loved. I sat there and I thought, you know what? Somebody's really thought about that. Somebody went, right, we want to make the Nostromo, and they only had a budget of £1.50, so they ended up just having to go to some sort of carpet outlet to make do. But yeah, this is where we pretty much spend most of the movie from here on in. And as the film goes on, we get to see even less of the ship, which is never a selling point. Normally the idea with these films is that, the ship is sprawling, and as the film goes on, you see more of it. But here we actually see less of it as the film goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. So at this point, the main propulsion system is still down. The cantankerous engineer Billy goes to the engine room or whatever it is to fix the engines. She touches a dripping goo, which, that seals everyone's fate in every horror movie ever made. She gets killed by a pair of tentacles with a claw at the end. And so what was your reaction to just these very low budget tentacles wrapping themselves around the engineer Billy and just blood inexplicably shooting out of parts of her body that have been untouched by said tentacles?
Well, there were 3 films that immediately sprung to mind when I saw the tentacles for the first time and the goo. The bit where she touches the goo, there was an Alien knockoff that came out about, I want to say 7 or 8 years before this, called The Intruder Within. There was a made-for-TV movie that became a full cinematic thing over in the UK. So the quality was clearly there. It wasn't. It was a terrible film. That film is very heavily centered around a crew finding some eggs on an oil rig site that drip a gratuitous amount of ooze. And if you touch the ooze, it causes the aliens to form a telepathic link with you where they can slowly take over your body.
Okay.
Yeah. So watching that sequence, it's pretty much there was a very similar sequence in The Intruder Within, and I was like, oh, okay, well that's that Alien knockoff that it's nicked a bit from. Okay, fair enough. The other one was The Evil Dead. I was reminded of the tree scene, in particular, the idea that it sort of wraps around the feet and then pulls her over and then, starts to very slowly sort of bump her off. It clearly took some inspiration because a lot of the direction that Raimi uses in The Evil Dead is focused around limbs in particular being sort of wrapped around by the tree branches.
Mm-hmm.
And in this film, to a much lower and lesser degree, they focus on feet and hands and the sort of face area as these tentacles are kind of wrapping around. The biggest problem that I had with it was that the actress clearly was doing a Bela Lugosi from what's it called, Bride of the Monster, where she's holding the tentacles to her face and physically shaking them to make them look like they're moving.
Yeah.
And which, you can do that, and that's, if it's done well, can be a little bit effective, but here she just sort of wiggles it, and it doesn't really pull off. And they really try to put a lot of blood into that scene. Especially there was a scene that a shot I remember of the tentacle wrapping around her hands. And I imagine what the director had in mind was that just a gratuitous amount of blood would just sort of shoot out of the sleeves of her jacket. But what ends up happening is you can clearly basically see where the hose pipe starts, and they've just got some intern offset just pouring like a gallon of corn syrup and red food coloring through a tube. It's a really, really messy death scene.
Despite not really being violent at all.
Yeah, it's one of the most sort of non-violent sort of death sequences that I've seen in a very, very long time. And again, the weirdness of the situation, the weirdness of why they've chosen to go that way with it is genuinely interesting to me. And that was another thing that sort of piqued my interest and kept me on board, so to speak.
So after Billy gets killed by these tentacles, Sherry goes to check on her in the engine room. She also touches the goo. There's goo everywhere. And she discovers Billy's desiccated corpse. We get some sort of pseudo psycho music, but on a synth. So that famous Bernard Herrmann violin sting, but on, I don't know, like a Kawasaki synthesizer from the 80s.
Yes.
Sherry runs away to Dr. Kimberly. Dr. Kimberly takes a sample of the slime. And within these, like, the last minute and a half that's happened, Cal and Roger have managed to get completely drunk.
Yes. And this is another thing I love about this film is they don't really have continuity for where the characters should be and what their motivations are at any given time. Cal and Roger go from sober to drunk to sober. Like, I want to know what they're drinking because it'd save me a lot of time and hassle in the long run. I should also really point out at this point that Sherry is probably one of my favourite characters in this because she literally... she has one of my favourite lines, which is where as soon as the space station blows up, she just stands there and screams, "We're all going to die!" Which was just... She delivers it so half-heartedly. It's beautiful. It really is. And the majority of the time she's on the screen, she's basically either being hit on by Roger or Cal. She's either bringing them food or she's an absolute panicked, screaming mess who... When I say panic screaming mess, what I mean is very bad acting panic screaming mess. And I just love that the film has her on board only for as long as it needs to have her. And when I say need, I mean only as long as the film can be bothered to have her.
Because, yeah, like you said, she doesn't really do much in this movie.
Not at all. I mean, apart from finding Billy, in terms of actual plot progression, I mean, she brings Cal a sandwich. That could be... I mean, it gives Cal the opportunity to make a joke about chicken pot pie. That's another thing that really bothered me about this film, actually, thinking about it. Right, so the space station explodes. We have another scene of all of the cast members just sort of looking at each other in silence as the camera pans through all of them. Again, so this is like the third or fourth time they've done that. And we're not even like a third of the way into the film at this point. And then, bearing in mind how many people died on that space station, bearing in mind how many people possibly were their friends who didn't make it, within 5 minutes, they're like, I'm hungry, and yeah, she's dead attractive, I'm going to go talk to her. And it's just like, what? Your friends died 10 minutes ago. What do you mean you're hungry and horny? Stop it.
Yeah, like a full 2 minutes into this whole ordeal, Cal has already staked out his claim to Sherry. And like you said, like, that's why I'm not sure how many people died. Potentially, like, it was a huge space station. It could have been thousands, but the reaction is just sort of like someone like spilled some water on the rug or something. Like, oh yeah, it's clean now. Whatever. Moving forward.
Yeah, basically. It's just, I mean, look, I get it that you can't really spend the entire film mourning the loss of the space station, because obviously that would become a bit one note, but at the exact same time, you know, have a bit more grief than like a minute of, oh no, followed by, where's the chicken pot pie? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And actually, it's at this point that we get my favorite line in this movie. So Sherry goes to Dr. Kimberly, and they call Cal and Campbell over the intercom, who is now drunk. And Dr. Kimberly says,
Sherry's just come back from the engine room and is hysterical. As far as I can tell, something has happened to Lieutenant Lynn, and it had something to do with the slimy substance all over Sherry's pants.
There's no good way to deliver that line.
No, I really hope she got paid well for that. I really do. That must have been a tough day in the office.
Yeah, and again, you know, horror movies are known for dumb character decisions, but what happens next is actually one of the dumbest things I've ever seen anyone do in a horror movie. So Dr. Kimberly knows that there's something on board that killed Billy. She's trying to communicate that to Cal and Campbell, who are drunk. So they're not really listening. They're kind of just laughing about it. And in a spaceship where everything is sectioned off by 3-foot-high corridors, she rips the intercom out of the wall, which disables her ability to talk to Cal and Campbell. And just watching that, I'm just like, what the fuck? Why would you ever write this into a movie?
That's a shot yourself in the foot moment there, really. And it's so literal, it's so on the nose. It's basically the writer going, I don't have a clever way to stop communication between these two groups of people, so I'm going to make them do a stupid thing and hope that no one notices.
Yeah, I mean, it couldn't possibly be that the alien that can access all systems aboard this starship shuts it down. That, I mean... They already wrote it into the script, but for whatever reason, they're just like, nah, she's just going to rip it out of the wall.
Well, this is another thing as well that at least for the first half of this film, runs as a continuous theme, and that is that everyone apart from Cal really, really hates Roger. like completely unrelentingly. Like, all of the women in this film treat him with absolute disgust. And I'm not saying that it's not completely unwarranted, because he is a little slimy at times.
For sure.
But there were a couple of moments where I was sitting there just going, oh, God, what? Leave him alone. He's just doing what he's doing now. He's just trying to get by. He's a schlub. And then what makes it even weirder is after about the halfway point in the movie, that all drops away. And then suddenly this character who isn't really that likable. I mean, he's not terribly unlikable, but he's certainly not likable, is then sort of portrayed as this kind of macho hero role. I mean, I'm making some notes on this whilst I was going through. I literally wrote something to the effect of if the moral of Alien was to listen to the smart woman who had the cat, this film's moral was do the opposite and fail miserably.
Absolutely.
Listen to the big stupid guy, and hopefully things will not be too terrible.
Yeah, and, so here Kimberly puts the goo sample into the computer. She finds out that the molecular structure of whatever this goo is doesn't require oxygen to live. Okay, so that explains how it killed the people at the beginning of the movie, and it explains a lot of stuff that's going to come up. And then this is the point where they reveal that they also have a map of the ship where humans are represented by red dots and the alien is conveniently represented by a white dot.
I wonder whether they've got the full spectrum or whether they're only sort of limited to set colours. If they bring a cat on, will it be a blue or will it be a white as well? I mean, I'm surprised that any spaceship that's housed these people in it hasn't got some kind of infestation of some kind, cockroaches, ants, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point to bring up, because the whole reason they introduced this map is so that Cal and Roger can be like, hey, Sherry, you need to shut the door because this alien's coming for you. And I got to tell you, she really needs to put her pep in that, because she just does not seem to give a fuck about getting this door shut at all.
No, not at all. Not at all. And that was another question, actually, that got raised. So they say that the colour of the dot depends on the user's, the individual's heat signature.
Mm-hmm.
So if you register as a certain heat signature, you'll show up as human, and if you show up as a different one, you'll show up as something else. But one of the things they don't really mention is that presumably the spaceship has some kind of air conditioning, and that would also be disabled when the oxygen was switched off. So all of the humans' temperatures in there would change drastically out, which would mean they wouldn't show up as red dots on the map anymore once anything happened.
Yeah, and beyond that, I think the computer says that the alien is made up of like silicon and chromium. So, I mean, how does it differentiate this inorganic thing that's alive from like just a box or a circuit board?
Yeah, for a lot of this film, I kind of had to literally take the MST approach of, it's just a show, I should probably relax.
Yeah, totally.
Because there's just so many just sort of moments where the director's basically saying, look, just trust us on this.
Yeah.
And as much as I'm on board with the film, there were a lot of points where I wanted to push back and go, no, this is stupid, go away.
Yeah, so because Sherry refuses to walk 3 feet to close the door, it's up to Cal to rescue her. So he scuttles through the corridors. Some tentacles reach out towards Sherry. She throws acid at the monster. We get some reused footage of dripping blood and goo that we saw earlier during Billy's death. Sherry is dead, and goo begins to seep out of her hands. That has no relevance before or after this scene, so I'm not sure why they did it. Cal's looking for the monster. He finds her corpse desiccated in much the same way that Billy's was, and the monster goes back into the vents.
Yes. And one of the things that I quite like about this film, but that very quickly becomes an irritant to me, is the shots that they use to show the alien at this point are really, really nice. They've got a nice sort of, they're all very moodily lit, and it's largely sort of pulsating,
yes,
sort of rubberized flesh, and everything's sort of dripping with slime.
Loved
and
it.
It's really, really nice cinematography. I just wish they didn't use it 726 times whenever they wanted to sort of show the alien for the rest of the movie, apart from towards the end.
Yeah, well, another way that they show the alien is through POV shots, and in this part particular, they show some POV shots where it seems like the alien is right in front of Cal, but he's like scanning the room as if he can't see it at all.
Yeah, which I didn't. Again, that was another moment where I didn't really understand what was going on at that particular junction. I mean, for me, I suppose the film could best be summed up as right up until about the halfway point, maybe slightly less than the halfway point, I was sort of on board with the film and I entirely kind of got it. I thought it was a bit sort of hokey, but by the time I'd got to the sort of third to halfway point through, I kind of accepted that the film was just going to do what it was going to do. So I just imagined that the alien could turn invisible. Because at this point it can... Well, yeah. I mean, at this point it can hear pretty much all conversations happening on the ship. It can see pretty much anything that it wants to going on. And it's capable of reducing people to just sort of mounds of bloody slush. So why not give it the ability to turn invisible at this point? I mean, it would probably explain how Billy was able to be attacked without seeing this beast roaming around a engine room that's the size of a bedsit.
Yeah, I mean, those tentacles have a long reach, man, because they never show the alien moving from room to room, but they do show those tentacles all over the ship.
Which is another thing. I mean, the design of the tentacles themselves are, they look relatively gnarly, but I think it probably would have looked even better if they'd have lubed them up along with the rest of the alien.
Yeah.
Because they look very, very dry, and equally, it's never really explained exactly how the tentacles kill, because they don't, it's not like, it doesn't look like it chokes them to death, and there's clearly some kind of cutting mechanic, because obviously most of the deaths involve them sort of bleeding uncontrollably, but they just look so lifeless. Through the whole thing, they just look so sort of bereft and just not... They're the least arsed killer tentacles I've ever seen in my life. They just can't be bothered to do anything.
Yeah. And I mean, at this point, Cal's just kind of like, oh, well, Sherry's dead. I'm going back to the control room. The tentacles start chasing him down the tunnel. Not really sure how. And he also gets killed by the tentacles. So this is about the 46-minute mark. And 3 out of 5 people are dead. So for me, the first time I was watching this, I was like, well, this is never, ever a good thing for a horror movie to do, because especially a low budget like this one, there's the exploitative aspect of I want to see these people die, but you've just completely blown your load 45 minutes into the movie.
Yeah.
So I guess, how were you feeling at this halfway mark?
I had, at that exact moment I was watching the film at that point, I had the same thought as you, which was, oh God, they've literally just thrown everything they had away. And this was also the start of where the significant problems for this film came in for me. Because the way that I kind of break this film down in my head, having watched the whole thing, is Act 1 runs from the very beginning up to when Cal is killed, and that's okay. That's, MST3K-esque sort of goofy, B-movie fried gold. That's the stuff that I live and breathe for.
Yeah.
The second act, which is everything from here on in till about 15 minutes before the end, is just dull. It's just so boring. The tone of the film changes significantly. It goes from being this kind of light-hearted, slightly hokey horror film that I was really on board with, to this very suddenly very sort of heroistic, sci-fi, deadly serious, well, I don't want to say epic, but like low-budget epic, and I just, the change in tone is like whiplash. As soon as Cal is gone, and the crew are pretty much reduced to Roger and Adrian, the rest of the film, up until about 15 minutes from the end, is just so straight-faced and so awkward to work through. It's a complete tonal change, and that kind of threw me, really, because then, like I say, I'd literally just spent the rest of the film sort of waiting for something to happen. But apart from a couple of little flourishes of comedy that happen while they're waiting and while they're trying to figure out ways to figure out whatever it is that's killed all the rest of the crew, I just kind of sat there and was like, just do something, do anything. Anything at all. They could do anything they wanted in this moment. They could, try and communicate with it. They could do anything they wanted, and they instead decide to spend at least 30 minutes just sitting, lying, and complaining about how thin the oxygen is.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, not a lot happens. We see some shots of this gooey alien sloughing off an outer layer of goo while staring at the crystal. We see more of these great model shots, which I really like those. Because that kind of goes along with, that's my whole aesthetic right there.
Yeah, I'm totally down with those as well. I think one of the main things that I noticed was that the SC-37 looked like a vacuum cleaner attachment, and as soon as it's that handmade nature. Like I say, I think it's because I'm an MST3K fan, and I've already been pre-programmed to know that when I see something that looks a little bit like the Satellite of Love or any of the other weird creations that Joel Hodgson's sort of built to have suspended in space, that it just sort of automatically plugs into that nice part of my brain. So watching these models that are not the most detailed in the world, I think it's fair to say,
right,
just sort of floating about was really quite comforting. It left me with a nice feeling that sort of carried me through the rest of the film.
Yeah, I loved it. 49 minutes into the movie, we finally get to see the monster's face for the first time, which normally, in creature features or monster movies, it's a good idea to hide it until the very end to keep up that suspense, but there was never any illusion of suspense in this one. So it's kind of like, why are you waiting so long to show your hand in this instance when you've already killed 3 people?
Absolutely. I mean, to me, when I first glanced on it, I thought that E.T. had a bad day. The closest that it sort of made me think in terms of comparisons to sort of real world Luke's was it reminded me a little bit of a chicken embryo. I don't know whether you've seen like a baby chick before, but it's sort of the embryo stage. It looks exactly like how the alien in this film looks, only much, much more slimier. It looks just like it's melting constantly. It also looks like one of the most pathetic alien sort of enemies I've ever seen in my life. I reckon the Predator could probably take it out in about 3 seconds.
Yeah, I mean,
if it could be bothered.
Wouldn't even put it as a trophy on his wall.
No. Well, it'd get the wall all messy and slimy. But I won't lie. I quite like how it looks aesthetically. It's certainly alien. It certainly looks alien. Whether it looks like a menace, that's a definite no. It doesn't look at all threatening in any way, shape, or form to me. But it's relatively well constructed. I reckon it could have looked significantly worse.
Yeah, no, I actually really love the alien design in this as well, probably because it is so atypical. I mean, one of the things I said in a recent review for Extro 2 is that the alien design is usually just different enough from an actual design used in 1979's Alien to avoid like any sort of copyright infringement. So I do like that they went a completely different direction with this one. That was pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And it's nice as well that it's animate as well, because a lot of these knockoff Alien films, like you say, they tend to borrow heavily from the Xenomorph, but also they tend to be fixed. They tend to be like, there's 4 points of articulation and that's it. The head doesn't move, the tail doesn't move, it's just a guy in a suit. Whereas here, it pulsates, it breathes, the eyes open and move around. Although there was one bit that did bother me. A little bit later in the film, you see a close-up of the alien's face and it opens its eyes and it's clearly got some dirt or grit or something stuck to its eye. And I sat there going, oh, please, somebody on the crew, rub it off. Please,
when the set is covered in KY, you're going to get some cat hairs or something stuck in it.
Oh, yeah, I just felt so sorry for it, though, because it hasn't got hands. And if it puts its tentacles on it, it's just asking for trouble.
Yeah. So I guess, not a whole lot happens here. The alien shuts off the air supply, but they overcome that. There's some domestic humor about eating Campbell's soup, more product placement. They watch video lasers, which, I mean, I gotta say, I can't wait until that format hits the streets, because video lasers, I can't even comprehend what that might entail. And so they watch 25 hours of laser cards. We get to actually see the space jocks from the beginning play football on Mars. And
in a comedy Benny Hill style, nonetheless.
Exactly. So they speed up the footage and start playing some goofy music while they play football. And then so at a certain point, another ship comes along and we get this radio contact that sounds completely ad-libbed, and it sounds completely like a parody of how airline pilots talk to you. There's a lot of like sort of we're coming up on USC 37. If you could just show us you're okay by doing a 30-degree right turn.
Yeah. No, that was one of the other moments that really sort of stuck out in my mind. By this point in the film, I was really struggling to figure out what the film wanted to be, because it keeps mixing light-hearted sort of human empathy style comedy and sort of random, well, like I say, Benny Hill gags with quite dark-esque horror moments. And it doesn't know whether it wants to be incredibly serious or incredibly campy and funny, which that was one of the... Textually, I quite like it, but it is frustrating because throughout the entire runtime, I never really knew where I was going to be in a 5-minute window. So 5 minutes from when they're watching Laser Video, it could be hilarious comedy or it could be graphic horror. It's going to be one of the two, and I don't know. And it doesn't work as well as like an Evil Dead 2, where the two elements are seamlessly woven into each other. It's more blocky. It's more, okay, we've done a funny bit, now we need a dark bit. Okay, now we've done a dark bit, we need a funny bit again. Now we need a bit where they're empathetic to each other. Now we need... It doesn't feel like the singular strands of these elements are very well interwoven.
Absolutely. And so very shortly after this, well, this ship is trying to contact the SC-37 and the alien has shut off all forms of communication. Roger throws a very ineffectual temper tantrum. That's one of those, I can't punch a hole in this cardboard set, so I'm going to pretend to slam my fists and kick, but not actually make contact with anything.
Yeah.
And we get a cut to the alien in his room, and he's telekinetically moving a wrench. And so then Adrian and Campbell stumble on some documentation about this alien. And it says that on these video lasers, that the alien was like a newborn baby that started to grow in size and intelligence. And after only a short period of time, it was able to solve a maze that a 9-month-old chimp couldn't figure out. So there's no telling how intelligent it is now. And the rock that we saw at the beginning was buried for over 300,000 years, which I was a little suspect about because it was only really under 6 inches of dirt at most.
Yeah, but then again, them space jocks, they're strong. So, maybe they dug really, really deep, but just you didn't notice because of how manly they were being.
Yeah. And so also they found out that the crystal that this alien has been staring at for an hour is some sort of extremely advanced computer that the alien can activate when it's confronted with a problem, and that the crystal is also a power supply. And then the SC-37 finds itself in the middle of a meteor storm.
Yes, and that is another massive MST3K moment.
100%.
Because those meteorites look so fake, ridiculously. They literally just could not screen painted polystyrene any harder if they tried. And given that the ship is very briefly bombarded, if I remember correctly with it, the crew sustain almost no damage. And again, it's another sequence that just kind of happens. Nothing is gained from it. Nothing is revealed as far as I remember.
Well,
it's just...
it does reveal a little bit, because at this point they're kind of grappling with the idea that this alien's not just a mindless killing machine. And at this point, the crystal creates a force field around the SC-37 and protects them from the meteor shower. So it does serve some very, very minute purpose in the narrative.
Okay, yeah. No, you have a point. Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, around this time as well, the alien starts to access the ship's computers to specifically look at religious texts for some reason. I mean, you've got the entire of Earth's history to go with. Religion isn't necessarily the worst place you could start, but you'd maybe start brushing up on, culture and history to get an idea of what you're currently dealing with rather than going right back, let's start at the beginning. I mean, unless you want to be thorough. I mean, I suppose the alien thought, well, I've got, well over 100 hours until we arrive at wherever we're getting to, so I might as well start at the beginning and work through. But yeah, again, this is another one where they hold the shot for too long, where he accesses the computer and you painfully see him scroll through every sub-menu until he arrives at the Christian Bible.
Quite a few
which
of the sub-menus are misspelled.
Yes, yes. And of course, he would start with the Christian Bible first, because with it being a Western film specifically, that's of course where things would start, even though probably there are Egyptian books or Greek books that would probably predate the Bible by hundreds of thousands of years that would probably be a better start.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just...
Yeah,
we're back into the realms of trying to fill that runtime again.
He starts off with Luke 6, verse 27, and moves on to Matthew 7, verse 12. It's weird that, he not only goes straight to the Bible, but goes straight to verses that will somehow end up being relevant to the story.
He's a very convenient alien. He saves us a lot of trouble, because otherwise we would have had to have sat through him reading the whole thing just to get to those two verses and go, ooh, that's quite useful. I'll keep on to that. That might be relevant in the third act.
Yeah, so at this point, the SC-37 is finally getting to the Alpha 7 ship, which looks exactly like an ironing board with Solo cups glued to it, spray painted gray. So that's another great MST3K-esque model in there.
This is the thing with these models as well that I really like, is that they didn't bother to paint any detail in. It's one colour. Every spaceship, apart from the main spaceship, is one colour. The space station was just all grey. The Alpha 7 ship is, again, just all gunmetal grey. That's it. There's no, speckling. There's no detail. It looks like they basically just put the prime colour on it and then went, that'll do.
Yeah.
Which is nice, because again, it totally sells you on the budget of this film.
Yeah. And one thing you mentioned to me in chat that we haven't touched on is you asked me to look for how many dismantled Millennium Falcon action figures appear in this movie. So
yes.
I guess I'm not as astute as you when it comes to this. I was only able to see the two that were very obviously just the Falcon cut in half and glued onto some doors. So let us know where those other 4 or 5 Millennium Falcons come into play.
I spotted 4, and there's a 5th one that I'm umming and ahhing about. So they got the 2 on the doors when they're coming in.
Mm-hmm.
There is 2 that have been split in half and used as there's like a panning shot of the space station after they fly out, where it sort of pans down the space station just before it explodes. And on the outer shell of it, they've put one on the top, and then they've got one that's smaller for a close-up of a bigger part of the model that's sort of stuck there. And then on the Alpha 7, towards the end, they've used another one as part of the detailing on the top of the ship. But it's been cut in half, so it's like 2 quarters and split out like a sort of W shape. They were all the ones that I could spot, but the fact that they used that many Millennium Falcons, I mean, just spray paint the Millennium Falcon, or cut it in half. You've got a spaceship there. The idea that they take so many of these and just destroy them to make their admittedly not that great looking models really shine through was quite interesting. But yeah. So I got 4 or 5 all in. I think it was 5 in total.
I'll have to look out for more on subsequent watches. So the whole thing with Alpha 7, they need to slow down the ship so that they can actually dock there. But the alien at this point has taken complete control over the ship. But after reading the Bible, the engine room activates its brakes. So, Campbell goes to check things out with a flamethrower to try to figure out why the alien has started to brake. He gets stopped by the alien because the alien has telekinesis. He makes Campbell drop the flamethrower and freezes him in place. And I'll let you handle this, because I really want to hear the first time watch perspective of what happens immediately at this point.
So the alien pushes Roger up against a wall and starts talking to him about morals and ethics. And Roger tries to rationalize with the alien by first accusing him of murder, to which the alien responds, well, they were trying to attack me, so it was self-defense. At which point Adrian comes climbing through the vents with a knife and looks like she's going to stab the alien, to which Roger, for some reason, screams and runs towards the alien.
Mm-hmm.
And then the alien shoves them both against the wall and holds them there. And then they repeat the argument of, you killed 3 people, it was self-defense again. And then Adrian promises that they're not going to kill the alien anymore. And the alien goes, oh, right, fair enough, I'll let you down then.
Yes. So
he lets them go, and then for the next 10 minutes, it basically that's another thing. They find out that the alien's name is Gar. And then the next 10 to 15 minutes could basically be described as a sort of 80s family sitcom. I sort of nicknamed this sort of final 15 minutes Gar in the Family, because it was just so sort of playful.
So this is the major spoilers, that this movie goes from an Alien ripoff to an E.T. ripoff, basically, kind of. And so I've been workshopping this a little bit, but I would like to see how you feel about my Gar impression as I reenact this scene you were just talking about. So, as you said, Adrian says something along the lines of, we didn't do anything to you, and you killed 3 of us. And then Gar says, you threw acid on me.
Oh, very nicely done. Right, a little bit of reverb on that, just a teeny bit of echo, and you are faultless. I'm going to have to hire you at some point for that.
Which, fair enough, they fucking threw acid on him. Like, that did happen. So,
yeah.
I don't know how these humans can claim to have any sort of moral high ground, because they tried to suck it into the vacuum of space. They threw acid on it.
They tried to shoot it as well.
Yeah.
It's just, considering, his argument isn't unfounded. He argues that basically humans are irrational and will attack anything that doesn't look the same as them. It's hard to disagree with him, because within an hour he gets shot, acid thrown on him, and nearly jettisoned out to space.
Yes.
And whilst there is moral discussions that can be had around those conversational pieces, I don't feel that Roger is the philosopher to deal with that.
Yeah, I don't think he has the mental faculties to really get into this conversation.
No.
And so we're an hour and 20 minutes in. This is when we finally get to see the alien all its glory. And so he's all like, I learned a respect of human life through the computer. Most of my knowledge prior to this came from the crystal, and killing was non-existent until I encountered humans. They have that scene where they somehow come to an understanding about they're not going to kill each other. And like you said, the movie does a complete about face where we get 10 to 15 minutes of just Gar, who may potentially have killed thousands of people at this point. Roger and Adrian just sort of palling around.
Yeah.
Playing board games.
I like the fact that they have the one joke which they run with through the whole of that sequence, which is just... one of them puts something on the table, and then Gar levitates it back to them. And they have a moment where they kind of double take as if to go, where's that thing that I've just put down? And then it appears next to them, like, oh, Gar.
Not again.
You're my favourite intergalactic murderer.
Yeah, it has a very E.T. Alfish quality. And so for me, this was specifically the reason that I suggested this movie, because I have never... I was floored the first time I saw this, because I've never seen a movie that attempts to do this. I don't think it works in Star Crystal because it's a 180 tonal shift. I'm not sure that it could possibly work in any movie. Perhaps the other way around, where the alien at first seems to be docile and friendly and then goes on a killing spree. But it's really hard to buy the whole, oh, this is so fun and happy, and Gar's just all... I'm sorry I killed your friend, Roger. When we just spent an hour and 20 minutes watching this alien kill people. I really want to know have you ever seen anything like this, and what are your feelings about it?
The closest that I've seen to something like this is probably one of the Quatermass films. I know that there's a Quatermass film where there's a killer alien on the loose, and at the end of the film it turns out that his motives are that he just needs to get home. And they kind of just sort of let bygones be bygones and let the alien go home without too much being
said. That presumably predates this, right?
Oh yeah, the Quatermass films were like the 1940s, 50s. But outside of those, I can't really think of anything. No, I was going to say Pod People, but that's probably not. Although it depends on which cut, because there are some cuts of Pod People where Trumpy kills people. Yeah, no, there isn't really anything concrete. There's no one film that I can distinctly point to that says that does it this way. But whilst I was watching this final act, I did come up with a fan theory that Gar is not as innocent as he appears.
Okay.
So, but we'll need to get to the end of the film before I can tell you that, because there's some spoilers in it that I don't want to jump the gun on, so to speak.
Gotcha. I mean, just in terms of narrative, do you think there is a way that this could ever possibly work, presented in such a way where we have violent killings and then oh no, it's no big deal?
I think possibly. I think if you can craft the narrative in such a way that the deaths that occur, while still shown as, abhorrent, are portrayed as he didn't know any better, or he was under the influence of something else, or whatever, it can maybe be a bit more forgiving on the audience, but it's a very difficult sell. It's a very difficult sell to get an audience after an hour and 20 to suddenly go, oh wait, no, he's a good guy, fair enough. I think if a writer played their cards very, very close to the chest and was somehow able to put across very clearly that the, quote, villain of the film was either misunderstood or didn't quite know what was going on, or was under the influence of some further evil power, it would probably sit better. But just a straight up, I don't want to kill anyone anymore, so now I'm a good guy, I don't think would float with anybody, really.
Yeah, and this whole thing is like, it's why it kills me that I can't find any information on Lance Lindsay. I really want to know what possessed him to write this movie. Is this supposed to be like proselytizing? Is it supposed to be like a religious message, like Christianity conversion type thing? Like, I want to know why this exists, basically.
Yeah, I mean, this film is definitely one I would love to. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't listen to directors' commentaries very often, but this would be one of the films that I would definitely dig out the director's commentary for, because if Lance Lindsay was talking me through his mind and process here, I'd buy a box of popcorn, I'd order a takeaway. That's my night. I'd just love to see what was going on in his mind. A lot of the time with these lower budget directors, unfortunately, it tends to be, I was thinking it would make me money, but but Lance, from what I've seen in this film, strikes me as maybe having an ulterior motive or some higher message that we mere filmies cannot fully appreciate.
Yeah.
One day we might get that commentary, and I really hope we do. But yeah, this was a very strange film that the more that I've been involved in its watching and understanding, the more I want to know more.
Yeah, me too. And yeah, this is like just the last 15 minutes. So they have the palling around. They finally get to Alpha 7. And it was only a few hours, if I remember correctly. It only took them. So like Gar becomes nice. And like 3 or 4 hours later, they get to Alpha 7 and they're best friends, during which time they play board games and shit like that. And so the whole thing is like Gar is going to need to take a ship to, I don't know, was it get to like his home planet or something?
Yeah, they don't make it clear. They say that it's for him to get home, but he never acknowledges that he needs to get home. He always just says he needs the ship. So I don't know, maybe the ship is his home or his imaginary home. I take it he's not Martian, because it says that it was buried there 300,000 years ago, and it'd be a real pain in the arse for him to go, oh God, I've got to turn around and now spend about 170 hours getting back home again. But yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, that part's not really well communicated, and whatever plans they're trying to come up with don't really work out. And so Gar is just kind of like, I guess I don't really need this ship after all. He says, I will remember you always. And then cue this song, which we've heard, the music part has been omnipresent throughout the film. They pretty much just only use this song. But It's a lovely ballad sung by Stefaniana Christopherson, who, interestingly enough, did the voice of Velma in Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? For the first season. And it's just a lovely song. And just that sort of ending of like, well, fuck it, we ran out of film, like we're just going to end here, really puts a nice cap on the whole experience. So at this point, now that we've gone through the entire plot, I would really love to hear your fan theory.
So my fan theory was that Gar was actually still evil all along. Let me just pull up my my notes for this. I've planned this out. So, Gar basically says that the way that he can get home is that he can convert Alpha 7 using the crystal to get it mobile and up in action and use that ship to get home whilst Roger and Adriana go off in the SC-37 back to Earth. Now, this raises two issues.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was that when the space station blows up at the very beginning of the film, Billy is asked a question by Roger, which is basically, is this ship capable of re-entering the Earth's atmosphere? And Billy says, it isn't currently, but with some time I can convert the engines to act as retro thrusters, which would mean we'd have a 60-40 chance of making it back into the Earth's atmosphere in one piece. Now, Gar would have been privy to that conversation because at that point he'd already gotten in with the computer, so he would have been able to listen in to the conversations that were being had on the ship's mainframe. But further still, Billy was killed more or less a couple of hours after that conversation was held, which means that the engines weren't retrofitted. So Gar knew that Roger and Adrian would not be able to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere in their current ship. So he very convincingly was like, no, I don't need this ship anymore. You can have that ship. You go back to Earth, get back down there, say hello. I'm going to go and jump on the Alpha 7. Now, the Alpha 7, the first time I watched this, I didn't realise that the ship at the very end was the Alpha 7. Right. I thought that was the SC-37 and that they'd just used a slightly different model. I thought that the Alpha 7, because they said it was a depot, I was imagining somewhere like Mos Eisley from Star Wars, kind of like an actual planet area. So on the second watch, when I watched it back, I realised it was a spaceship, and I sort of came to the conclusion of, well, hang on a minute, that's going to have a crew, because it's a depot. It's where people sort of sell their wares and do all that. Now, unless Roger goes on to the Alpha 7 and explains, hang on a minute, I know he looks weird, but trust me, he's a really good alien. He's not going to kill anybody. You know, as soon as Gar strolls onto the Alpha 7, he's going to get gunned down, shot, acid spilled on. It's going to all happen again. So my train of thought was that Gar knew that the ship wasn't going to get back into the Earth's atmosphere. So he's left Roger and Adrian to go and die, whilst he jumps onto the Alpha 7, kills all of the crew, and then turns the ship around and goes home and does whatever it was he was planning on doing with the SC-37. And that actually he was evil all along. He just gave the illusion of being friendly because he digested all of human knowledge and realised that he could get what he wanted by being nice to people rather than just murdering them off.
Wow. So
also, with it being one other thing as well, also with it being a depot, it would have more supplies than the SC-37 would have, which would mean it would make more sense for him to jump on the Alpha 7 rather than live off what supplies he could scrape together on the SC. So that was another reason why I didn't kill him off. But yeah, that's just my crazy fan theory about how Gar is definitely still the worst, most evil alien in the galaxy.
Well, I gotta say, if this blank check situation ever actually arises, I would love to see Dan's Star Crystal too.
Crystal harder.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually really love that, and even though I just watched it last night, I kind of want to watch it again to see if there's any more supporting evidence that we didn't pick up on, but I think that's great. That's awesome.
Well, this is the thing, when you watch it with that in mind, when he's being really polite, it becomes so sinister. It becomes almost like Hal-esque. Like,
yeah, totally.
He's sort of sitting there going, I'll help you with this tin opener. I don't need all these supplies. You take as much as you need. And he's just sitting there going, I know what your game is. Be careful.
Yeah, so before we wrap up and give final thoughts, there's two things I wanted to point out about the credits. So the voice of Gar is credited to the Gling, whatever that means. And
the gargling.
Hey, yeah, possibly. And then
it's a Sue Diddley-Udenim.
At the very end of the movie, it says, filmed entirely in space.
Yeah, they might run into some legal trouble with that. I mean, I don't want to be the guy to sue Lance Lindsay, but he's going to need to prove that.
Hey, I'd love to sue Lance Lindsay just so he could answer for this movie. If that's the only way to get a hold of him, so be it.
It comes to something when the court documents give you more of an insight into the film than the DVD.
Yeah, so I guess on that note, Dan, what are your overall thoughts on Star Crystal?
I quite enjoyed it. I'll be honest. I don't think it's necessarily one that I would revisit all the time. It's not a regular watch, but it's got a lot of really fun bits going for it. It's a ludicrous film in the nicest possible way. I like the hard twists and turns, even though they don't work filmatrically or theatrically. Mm-hmm. They do work in terms of hitting you upside the head with a frying pan every 10 or 20 minutes to remind you that the scene has changed. Because the worst thing a film like this can do is bore you.
Mm-hmm.
And in the second act, it does that, which is a real shame, because I think if the second act had a bit more pep, it would consistently across the board be enjoyable. Mm-hmm. But the first and third acts certainly are just something else. I mean, I would quite happily watch it again. But like I say, I don't think it's one that I would jump on regularly. I think it'd be one for a good double feature fodder. Take it with another Alien knockoff film or another sci-fi sort of epic,
mm-hmm.
and I think you'd probably have a really good time with it. If I could be critical of it in any way, shape or form, the only thing that I would do is, and I do this with most films, is just trim about 20 minutes out the middle. And I think other than that, it would be nice and reasonable.
Do I hear a TYTD fan edit of Star Crystal in the future?
Well, never say never.
I mean, it probably wouldn't be hard. Like you said, just literally take 20 minutes out of it.
Yeah. Leaving the space football, obviously, because, those jocks really need that endorsement because they were the first people to play on Mars. But the rest, that can all go. So I'll get it up on fanedit.com.
Oh, hell yeah. So if you were to recommend this to, I guess, a specific audience, who would you recommend it to? Or would you recommend it at all?
I think if I was going to recommend it to anybody, Mystery Science Theater fans would probably be the ones that would appreciate it the most. I don't think that this is a film that a younger audience would necessarily really get on with, but I think probably some people who are into bad movies would really get a lot out of this. Whether I can recommend it just generally, I'm not sure. I think that second act is the real clincher. I think if you can stomach that middle ground, you'll be fine, and I think you'll really get a lot out of it. But if you haven't got the patience to sit through that middle act, you'll just wonder what on earth we've been talking to for the last hour and a half. You'll just think, well, what are these guys seeing that I'm not? Which, I don't know. I think to the right person, I would definitely recommend this. But generally, no. I don't think that this would be something that everybody could just switch on and be like, oh, this is great.
Yeah.
It takes a very specific mind.
Absolutely. I mean, so overall, the first time I watched this, I got to say, like you, that portion when 3/5 of the crew is dead, in between that and the big reveal, I thought this was a really boring movie. But it was so unique that it has absolutely stuck with me since the first time I saw it. The second time around, I think I actually kind of love this movie. One thing I say is that I will always respect someone swinging for the fences and striking out rather than getting walked on 4 consecutive balls, which basically is to say, as long as you aspire to do something other than just simply make a movie, I'll respect you for it. And definitely with the absolutely ludicrous twist in this, Lance Lindsay was shooting for something. Whether or not he was successful, that's a different conversation, but I respect the hell out of trying to do something different.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think I have so much respect for the mavericks who try in the face of adversity or in the face of mediocrity than the people who just do paycheck movies, who are just like, yeah, we're going to make a movie, it's done. Next film. I have a total respect, even if it turns out to be utter garbage. I have total respect for the people who make films and they have their own vision about those films. If somebody's just churning them out one after another, it's not the same as having the passion to actually go out and make it. And that's why I like the people who made films like Manos, The Hands of Fate, or Egar.
Mm-hmm.
These films aren't award-winning masterpieces. These are just one-off films that were made by people who had a vision. But it's that vision that I respect, because at least they went out and actually did it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's really similar to the movie I covered with George, Extro, in that they're both sci-fi alien horror movies, and you can just tell that for whatever reason, someone had a calling. They had some crazy ass idea, and there's like, I've got to get this idea out to the rest of the world. It is so important that people watch Star Crystal.
Totally. And you mentioned films like Extro, to chime in on that one. Again, you hit the nail on the head. Extro is a fantastically bewildering movie. And again, yeah, it comes from somebody who had a vision. And despite the fact that after Extro, he seemingly only went on to make, well, Extro 2 and 3.
Mm-hmm.
The less said about those, the better. The fact that he had that distinct vision to make the first one, and it turned out the way that it did, for better or worse. I mean, it's a hell of a watch. I mean, you can pull so much out of that film if you analyze it. It's just next level type filmmaking. But this is what I'm talking about when I was saying at the very beginning of this, that one of the things I enjoy doing is tearing down cult and questionably dubious films over just the classics, because, you know, the amount of fun you can get out of tearing down films like Star Crystal or Extro and finding what makes them work versus doing something like Goodfellas is tenfold. There's so much stuff you can pull out of both of these films, in terms of what messages they might be trying to put out, and why the director chose to film things in a particular way, and why does that clown have a hypno disc, and all these little things just, really say volumes about these auteur filmmakers, these one-off people who just sort of throw things into the ether and then vanish.
Absolutely.
I mean, we never may know who Lance Lindsay is, but I feel like I know him a lot better having watched Star Crystal.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, pretty much the high points you singled out are what I like about it. I'm a sucker for creature features. This movie has the exact aesthetic that I like. In terms of recommendations, so I would recommend it to anyone. It's one of those ones, like, just look at the cover. You know whether or not this is going to be your thing. But also, I think it's a good recommendation in the same terms you were talking about Cannibal Holocaust, which is basically, I'm going to show my friends Star Crystal. I'm not going to tell them anything about it. I'm just going to have my eyes glued to their face as Gar starts talking and playing board games with the crew.
You are a cruel man, but I greatly admire that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's not... I'll probably rewatch it maybe once a year maximum, which is more rewatchability than this movie has any right to have, all things considered.
Absolutely. I mean, like I say, that was why I was so surprised by the IMDb listing for it, because, like I say, a 3.5 seems overly harsh for this film. I mean, I'd probably give it at least... I mean, I don't do ratings as a rule, but I would have expected it to have been at least around double that, in terms of it being competent filmmaking to an extent, because when you consider the kind of schlock that exists on IMDb, for that one to be almost like considered as bad as the works of, The Beast of Yucca Flats or The Skydivers is just... I don't get it. But then I suppose it's because the amount of people who voted on it is so low. If more people voted to give it a medium sort of range score, it might be a bit better received.
Yeah, this is your call to action, Video Drones. Go watch Star Crystal and go pump up that rating on IMDb.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you, Dan. So at this point, we've, gotten to the end of things, and I would just like to give you the opportunity to plug anything you have going on. So this is going to release on the 25th, which conveniently is sandwiched between two upcoming projects you have. So if you wanted to plug those and talk about them a little, that'd be great.
No, that's absolutely fine. First of all, though, I'd just like to thank you so much for having me on here. It's been a real blast to properly nerd out about forgotten, obscure, and somewhat terrible movies. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
And if there's ever an opportunity to come back, I would certainly relish the opportunity. So
I would love to have you back, and just stick this in your craw for future reference. I'd like for you to pick something for me to watch. So,
ooh, okay.
Yeah,
I'll
anyways,
keep that in
continue.
mind. Thank you. So yeah, obviously I have my YouTube channel, TYTD Reviews. We upload every Friday. Coming up over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be covering a Video Nasty classic, which was Anthropophagus the Beast, which is a Greek-Italian co-production starring cannibal murderers, which is always good fun. Then I'm going to be covering Celia the week after that, which, as we mentioned at the top of the review, prepare for me being a little bit grumpy in that one. And to close it all off, we're doing a month on Sleepaway Camp. We're covering all of the Sleepaway Camp movies to round off this season before I go on to a very mild hiatus over the summer while I work on the rest of the year's episodes. So plenty coming up and plenty to look forward to. And I also have a website, www.tytdreviews.com, where I go even further in depth beyond the reviews, and I sort of expand out more of my personal thoughts on where I was when I was watching the film, and sort of it's sort of a hybrid blog and expanded film review on top of that. So those would be the two go-to points.
Awesome. Yeah. And if you enjoyed Dan talking on here, you will definitely enjoy his channel and his website. It's got a lot of good blogs on it. Clearly a guy that I could talk to for hours about just random bullshit. But in respect of Dan's time, we're going to call it a night. So do you have any parting words for the audience, Dan?
I just want to say, go and check out Star Crystal if you can. Thank you for putting up with my British accent. I know that it's not the sexiest voice in the world. I could have been Southern, but unfortunately I'm a Northerner, so it's a little bit harder. But yeah, again, just thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for having me on the show. I've really, really appreciated it.
Absolutely.
It's been great to hang out with you, man.
Yep, and that is where we will take our leave.
I will always remember you. Goodbye.
In space with a stranger, we do what we believe in. Safety or danger, there's no place left to hide. We travel